It's late. I'm glad you're here. I'm Tim. If you're new, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Whatever you were carrying today, you can set it down at the door. It'll still be there in the morning if you want it back. 4 stories tonight. The first is set in the autumn of 1937. And it's about a locomotive engineer on the Great Northern Railway's overnight run from Fargo to Havre, Montana, and about the lantern he sees on the shoulder at milepost 314 on 3 consecutive nights, and about what he finds when he decides to stop. The second is about a rural doctor in a small county in Vermont, alone in her practice for 30 years, and about the old woman she comes to see, standing at the bend of Route 100 on the afternoons her patients drive home from her office with the hardest news of their lives. The third is about the overnight tender of a small drawbridge over the Fox River in eastern Wisconsin, and about the wooden lake tug that passes under her raised bridge at 3:14 every morning, and about what it means to have been doing a piece of work for 34 years without knowing you have been doing it. The fourth is about an overnight snowplow driver on Interstate 94 in central North Dakota, and about the things that begin to appear on the road at mile marker 168 on the first Wednesdays of December, and about a man from the driver's past who was there before them. Long ones tonight, the kind you settle into. You don't have to keep up. You don't have to remember any of it in the morning. If your eyes get heavy in the middle of one, that's the whole point. I'll keep talking. You'll drift. The stories will keep going. A like helps another tired person find their way here on some long night. A subscribe brings me back to you on the next one. So settle in. Pull the blanket up. Let the day fall away. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. When you're ready, we'll begin. Ansel Weldon was 47 years old and had been a locomotive engineer for the Great Northern Railway for 22 years. And on the second Thursday of October, 1937, on the westbound overnight run of train number 27 from Fargo, North Dakota to Havre, Montana, at 3:47 in the morning at milepost 314, on the Milk River line. He saw the lantern by the track for the first time. He had come to the railroad in 1915, at the age of 25, after 5 years of working in the wheat elevators in Grand Forks, and 1 year of trying and failing to make a go of a small farm his father had left him outside of Larimore. He had come to the Great Northern because his cousin Halden Weldon had been a brakeman on the railroad and had spoken well of the work, and had, on one visit home to Grand Forks in the spring of that year, sat with Ansel on the porch of Ansel's father's house, and had told Ansel that if he was willing to start as a wiper in the roundhouse at Fargo, he could work his way up. Ansel had gone to Fargo the following week. He had wiped locomotives for 2 years. He had, in the manner of a young man who had come to the railroad from a wheat elevator and a failed farm, done the work well. He had learned the hot smell of a locomotive that had just come off the road. He had learned the patience of standing under a Class G3 480 Pacific with a bucket of solvent and a rag and cleaning the grime off the rod bearings while the machinist watched him. He had learned the respect for a locomotive that a wiper learned from cleaning them, and that no amount of later training in the cab could quite replace. He had been promoted to fireman in 1917. He had fired locomotives for 8 years. He had, in the manner of a young man who had spent 2 years as a wiper, taken to firing well. He had learned the rhythm of the coal, the position of the hot spot in the firebox of the class of locomotive he was firing on the run, the pressure of the boiler at the position of the throttle. He had, by 1923, been considered by the master mechanics of the division as one of the top firemen the division had. He had been promoted to engineer in 1925. He had been an engineer for 12 years. For the last 8 of those years, he had run the overnight westbound run of train number 27, the passenger run from Fargo to Havre by way of Grand Forks, Devil's Lake, Rugby, Minot, Williston, and Wolf Point, on the stretch of the Great Northern Main Line that followed the Milk River across the northern edge of eastern Montana. His fireman on the run was a man named Ovid Slatten. Ovid was 32. He had come to the railroad in 1929 at the bottom of the Depression, when there had been no other work in Minot where he had been living, and had taken a job as a wiper because it was work. He had made fireman in 1932. He had been Ansel's fireman for 5 years. He was a big man, 6'2", with the wide back of a fireman who had shoveled coal for 5 years. He was quiet on the run. He did not speak unless spoken to. He shoveled well. The locomotive on the overnight run of train number 27 was a Class S2484 Northern-type steam locomotive, one of the new ones the Great Northern had put into service in 1930. She was numbered 2529 on her cab side. She was a heavy locomotive, 380 tons in her working weight. She could pull the 12-car consist of number 27 up the grade east of Wolf Point at 40 miles an hour without breathing hard. Ansel had been running her for the whole 8 years he had been on the run. He knew her the way a man knows a horse he has ridden every day for 8 years. Train number 27 left Fargo at 7:15 in the evening. It ran through Grand Forks at 8:50, where Ansel's wife, Marilee, and their 14-year-old son, Corwin, sometimes came down to the depot to see him off in the summer months, when the light was still up at 8:50. In October, when the sun had set at 6:30, they did not. It ran through Devil's Lake at 10:20. It ran through Rugby at 11:45. Rugby was the point where the crew changed. Ansel and Ovid took the train from Rugby to Havre, and the crew that had brought her from Fargo went back east on the overnight eastbound. They pulled out of Rugby at midnight even. They ran through Minot at 1:20, Williston at 3:10, Wolf Point, which was the first station on the Milk River line in Montana, at 4:30. Milepost 314 was between Wolf Point and Poplar. It was in the stretch of the Milk River line where the tracks ran along the north bank of the river through the low bluffs and the cottonwood breaks of that part of eastern Montana. It was, on the reckoning of a man who had run that stretch for 8 years, the darkest stretch of the run. There were no towns, no crossings, no ranch lights. The stars in the sky above were the stars. The curve of the river was invisible in the dark. The stretch was 10 miles long. It took the train about 14 minutes to pass through it. At 3:47, that October morning, Ansel was at the throttle. Ovid was at the firebox. The locomotive was doing 42 miles an hour on the level tangent through the stretch. The headlight was throwing the yellow cone of its beam onto the tracks ahead. At milepost 314, Ansel saw, in the yellow cone, a lantern. The lantern was on the west side of the tracks, about 15 feet from the rail. It was an old lantern of the type that had been used on the railroad in the 19-teens and before. A brass-bottomed kerosene lantern with a wire bail and a globe of the type that had gone out of common use on the railroad about 20 years earlier. Ansel had, as a wiper in the roundhouse at Fargo in 1915, cleaned the brass bottoms of lanterns exactly like it. The lantern was lit. The yellow flame of the wick was steady in the still air. There was no one holding the lantern. The lantern was, on the look of it, standing on the ground beside the tracks. Ansel passed it in about a second. He did not reduce speed. He did not throw the brake. He did not, in the way of an engineer who was moving 42 miles an hour on the overnight run of number 27, do anything at all except pass the lantern. He looked back over his shoulder as they passed. He looked at Ovid, who was closing the firebox door and was reaching for his shovel for the next scoop. Ovid had not seen the lantern. Ovid was on the fireman's side of the cab, which was the left-hand side, and the lantern had been on the right-hand side, and the view from the fireman's seat did not take in the right-hand shoulder of the right-of-way. Ansel did not say anything. He looked ahead at the tracks, running away into the dark. He thought about the lantern for the rest of the run. He thought about it in the way a man of 47, who had been an engineer for 12 years, and a fireman for 8 years before that, thought about a lantern he had seen where a lantern should not have been. He thought about the way the brass had caught the light of his headlamp, the pattern of the reflection on the curve of the base, the way the wire bale had thrown a small shadow across the ballast beside it. He thought about the flame. The flame had been steady. There had been no wind at milepost 314 that night. No wind, he had noticed, but a flame in a lantern outside on a shoulder in October in eastern Montana should have moved at least a little from the pressure wave of the passing train. This flame had not moved. He had seen it clearly. He had watched it for the second and a fraction that the pass took, and the flame had been as steady as a flame in a lantern in a windless room. He thought about who would leave a lantern on the shoulder of the right-of-way at milepost 314 at 3:47 in the morning. There was no ranch within 4 miles of that milepost. There was no road. There was no reason for anyone to be on that shoulder at that hour. The nearest habitation was the Gilroy Ranch, about 4 miles north of the tracks, and the Gilroys were, on Ansel's knowledge of the county, an older couple who kept regular hours and who would not be walking the tracks in the dark. There was nothing at milepost 314 that a person on the ground would come to. It was just a stretch of ballast and rail and the low bluffs above the river. He thought about the type of lantern. The brass-bottomed kerosene lantern with the wire bale and the round globe was, as he had noted at the time, a type that had gone out of common use on the railroad about 20 years earlier. Ansel had, as a wiper, cleaned dozens of them in 1915 and 1916. By the time he had made fireman in 17, the newer type of lantern had come in, a flatter, more rectangular kerosene lantern with a different globe, made by a different manufacturer, that had become the standard on the Great Northern in the years before the war. The older type had been retired to museum display at some of the division offices, or had been sold as surplus, or had gone into private hands. It was not the sort of lantern a working railroad man in 1937 would be carrying. He ran the possibilities in the way an engineer runs them, quietly, in a certain corner of the mind, while the other part of the mind kept the throttle at the right position, and kept an eye on the water glass, and kept an eye on the boiler pressure, and kept an eye on the road ahead. They arrived at Havre at 7:26 a.m. Ansel did the paperwork in the engineer's office at the Havre Roundhouse. He went to his rented room in the boarding house on 3rd Street, where he stayed on his layovers between runs. He slept until 3 in the afternoon. He ate dinner at the cafe on 1st Street. He walked back to the Roundhouse for the evening westbound run, number 19, the local, which he ran to Shelby and back, and which put him back in Hobb at midnight. He slept a few hours. He was on the eastbound run of number 28 at 8 in the morning, taking her back to Rugby. The run was uneventful. On the eastbound run, he passed milepost 314 at about 8 in the morning, in the gray light of an October dawn. There was no lantern. He arrived in Rugby at 3:15 p.m. He took the train home to Grand Forks. He got home at 7 that evening. He ate supper with Marilee and Corwin. He went to bed at 9. He slept for 11 hours. He was back on the westbound run of number 27 the next evening. The run out from Fargo was ordinary. The consist that night was 12 cars, a mail car, a baggage car, 3 coaches, 2 sleepers, a diner, 4 more coaches. The train left Fargo at 7:15. Ansel took her out into the evening the way he always took her out. He rolled through the Red River Valley with the last of the daylight fading behind them to the west. He ran through Grand Forks at 8:50 and looked at the empty platform where in summer his wife and son sometimes came down to see him off, and did not see them there because it was October and dark. He rolled through Devil's Lake at 10:20. He rolled through Rugby at 11:45. He handed off to Ovid at Rugby and took on the waybill for the westbound section. He pulled out of Rugby at midnight even. He ran through Minot at 1:20, through Williston at 3:10. He was aware, in the corner of his mind that ran independent of the throttle and the water glass, that he was coming up on milepost 314. He was not sure what he expected. He had, in the day between the runs, told himself several times that what he had seen the night before had been a trick of the light or a stray reflection from something else on the shoulder, a piece of glass, a discarded bottle, a piece of the metal debris that sometimes gathered on the right-of-way from passing trains. The lit lantern quality of it had been, he had told himself, a matter of how his headlamp had struck whatever the object was. There was a reasonable explanation. He had not fully believed himself. On the westbound run, at milepost 314, at 3:47 in the morning, he saw the lantern again. It was in the same place. On the west side of the tracks, about 15 feet from the rail, it was the same brass-bottomed kerosene lantern. It was lit. There was no one holding it. The flame was steady in the still air, in the exact same way it had been steady the night before. He passed it in about a second. He did not reduce speed. He did not throw the brake. He looked at Ovid. Ovid had not seen it. He thought about the lantern for the rest of the run. He did not tell Ovid. They arrived at Hive at 7:26. Ansel ate breakfast at the cafe on First Street. He walked to his rented room in the boarding house on 3rd. He lay on the bed with his boots off and his coat still on, and looked at the ceiling for about an hour. He slept for 4 hours. He got up. He ate dinner at the cafe. He walked back to the roundhouse. He ran the evening local. He came back to Have at midnight. He slept for 4 more hours. He was on the eastbound of number 28 in the morning. On the eastbound at milepost 314, there was no lantern. It was daylight. He looked at the shoulder as he passed. There was nothing on the shoulder. There was no track in the dust. There was no ash from a fire. There was no glass. There was no piece of metal debris. The shoulder was, on the daylight look of it, an ordinary stretch of ballast and dust that had not been walked on by anyone in some considerable time. He rolled on east. He was through Wolf Point at 8:30, and through Williston at 9:40, and through Minot at 11:50, and into Rugby at 3:15. He took the train home to Grand Forks. He got home at 7. He ate supper with Marilee and Corwin. He read the newspaper. He did not tell Marilee about the lantern. He did not tell Corwin about the lantern. He went to bed at 9. He slept for 8 hours. He got up at 5 in the morning. He had coffee at the kitchen table. He watched the light come up through the kitchen window. He thought about the lantern. He thought about the layover, and about what he had been thinking on the layover, which was not much of anything, because he had been avoiding thinking about the lantern in the way a man avoids thinking about something that is going to come up, whether he thinks about it or not. He thought that if he saw the lantern a 3rd time, on the 3rd consecutive run, he would stop. He thought about what he would do when he stopped. He thought that he did not know. He was back on the westbound run of number 27 the next evening. On the third night at milepost 314, at 3:47 in the morning, he saw the lantern for the third time. That was when he decided to stop. He said, "Ovid." Ovid said, "Yes, Cap." Ansel said, "There is a lantern on the west shoulder at milepost 314. I am going to bring her to a stop." Ovid said, "Cap." Ansel said, "I have seen it 3 nights running. I want to know what it is." Ovid said, "Cap, we are on a schedule. If we stop for a lantern, we are going to be late into Havre." Ansel said, "I know." Ovid said, "The dispatch is going to want to know why." Ansel said, "I will tell the dispatch." Ovid said, "What are you going to tell them, Cap?" Ansel said, "I will tell them I saw a lantern on the shoulder and stopped to investigate a possible obstruction. That is a reason to stop the train. It is a reason I am authorized to stop the train for. I am going to stop." Ovid said, "All right, Cap." Ansel began to reduce the throttle. He set the automatic brake. 2529 came down slowly through the dark. From 42 miles an hour to 30. From 30 to 20. From 20 to 10. From 10 to 5. They came to a stop at milepost 314 with the pilot of the locomotive about even with the lantern. The lantern was on the west shoulder. Ansel opened the side window of the cab and looked out. The lantern was, at the close distance, exactly the lantern he had seen on the 2 previous nights. A brass-bottomed kerosene lantern with a wire bail and a globe. It was lit. The yellow flame of the wick was steady in the still air. There was no one holding it. Ansel said to Ovid, "I am going to get down and have a look." Ovid said, "Cap, do you want me to come with you?" Ansel said, "No. Stay in the cab. Keep her at pressure. If I am not back in 5 minutes, take her forward slowly to the end of the block signal and stop and radio the dispatch." Ovid said, "Yes, Cap." Ansel put on his coat. He put on his cap. He picked up his own brass-bottomed kerosene lantern, the one he kept in the cab for exactly the occasions when an engineer needed to get down and look at something. He lit it. He climbed down the ladder on the side of the cab. He stepped onto the ballast beside the rail. He walked forward past the pilot of the locomotive. He walked to the lantern. He stopped about 10 feet from it. He raised his own lantern. He looked at the ground around the other lantern. There were no footprints in the dust of the shoulder. There was no track of anyone having approached the lantern from any direction. The shoulder was, on the look, undisturbed. The lantern was, on the look, sitting on the ground the way a lantern would sit if it had been set down. But there was no one there. Ansel stood for a moment. Then he heard, in the dark to the west, a sound. It was the sound of a locomotive. Not his locomotive. His locomotive was behind him, idling at the low pressure that a fireman kept the locomotive at when it was standing on the line waiting. His locomotive had the familiar sound of 2529 idling, which was the sound Ansel had lived with for 8 years. The sound in the dark to the west was a different sound. It was the sound of an older locomotive, a smaller one. It had the higher-pitched exhaust of a smaller class of engine, and the lighter chuff of a smaller boiler, and the rhythm of a slower drive. Ansel turned toward the sound. He looked west along the tracks. He could not see anything at first. The tracks ran away into the dark, and there was nothing to be seen in the yellow of his lantern past about 50 feet, and there was nothing to be seen past that in the dark. Then he saw, in the dark, a light. It was a yellow light. It was the light of a locomotive headlamp. It was coming toward him along the tracks from the west. Ansel stood very still. He watched the light come on. The light was, on the look of it, the yellow of a carbon arc headlamp of the type that the Great Northern had used on its passenger locomotives in the years before 1908, when the company had converted its passenger locomotives to the electric headlamps that were in use now. A carbon arc headlamp was a piece of equipment that Ansel had. As a wiper in the roundhouse at Fargo in 1915 cleaned exactly twice, on 2 locomotives that had come into the roundhouse for the final scrapping in the summer of that year. The carbon arc headlamp had been the standard of the Great Northern from the 1890s through the first decade of the 20th century. It had gone out of common use on the railroad about 30 years earlier. The locomotive came into the range of Ansel's lantern. It was a Class F8-460 American-type steam locomotive. It was numbered 892 on its cab side. It was, on the look of it, a locomotive of the Great Northern Railway from the late 1890s. Ansel had seen a photograph of a Class F8 in the book about the history of the Great Northern that the master mechanic at the Fargo Roundhouse had kept on the shelf in his office. Ansel had, on the occasion of his hiring as a wiper in 1915, been shown the photograph by the master mechanic, who had said, "This is what the railroad ran when it was young." Do not forget where the railroad came from. The locomotive was moving at about 10 miles an hour. It came down the tracks toward Ansel and toward 2529, standing behind him. Ansel stepped off the tracks to the east side. The locomotive came on. At about 30 feet away, he could see the engineer in the cab. The engineer was a man in a cap. The engineer was leaning out the side window of the cab, looking at Ansel. The engineer's face was a face Ansel had never seen before. The face was, on the look, the face of a man of about 50, weathered, with the mustache of an era earlier than Ansel's. The eyes were pale eyes. The eyes were looking at Ansel. The engineer lifted his hand in a slow wave. Ansel lifted his hand in return. The locomotive came past. She was, at close range, everything a Class F8-460 of the Great Northern from the late 90s would have been. The high stack, the polished brass of the bell over the boiler, the wood-lagged jacket around the boiler, still varnished dark. The cab painted the dark green of the era with a gold leaf number on the panel below the cab window. The pilot at the front, the old-style pilot, with a curve of iron slats that had gone out of use by 1905. The oil headlamp housing, which held the carbon arc that was throwing the yellow light. The connecting rods going up and down in the slower rhythm of a smaller drive, turning at a rate that Ansel could have named the speed of exactly, from the count of the exhaust beats. The exhaust from the stack was steam and coal smoke. Ansel could smell the coal smoke as she passed him. It was the smell of coal from an era, a higher sulfur coal that the railroad had used from the northern Rocky Mountain mines in the 90s, that had been phased out by the 20-teens in favor of the cleaner burning coal from the eastern Montana fields that Ansel had been burning his whole career. He had not smelled that older coal since he had been a small boy at his father's house in North Dakota, watching the old trains of the early Great Northern come through Larimore. She was pulling a consist of 8 cars behind her. The cars were the wooden passenger coaches of the late 1890s, painted the dark green of the Great Northern of that period, with the gold leaf lettering along the letterboard reading Great Northern in the old font. Each coach had the tall, narrow windows of the era, with the arched tops. Each coach had the brass railings on the vestibules at either end. Each coach had the gas lamps mounted along the interior ceiling that Ansel could see through the windows as the cars passed them. The interior lights of the cars were on. Ansel could see, in the windows as the cars passed him, the silhouettes of the passengers. He looked at them. He looked hard. Some were were sitting in seats, reading. He could see the angles of their heads bent over what he assumed were newspapers or books. In the second coach, he saw a woman in a high-collared blouse of the era, her hair up in the style of the 90s, reading what looked like a small book by the gaslight above her seat. In the third coach, he saw a man in a dark suit and vest, with a pocket watch across the front, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, looking straight ahead the way a man looks who is thinking about something. In the fourth coach, he saw two children, a boy and a girl, in the clothes of the era, the boy in a short jacket and knickerbockers, the girl in a pinafore over a dress, asleep on the shoulder of what appeared to be their mother, a woman in a dark traveling dress with a hat still on her head. Some were sleeping. In several of the coaches, he could see the slumped shapes of passengers who had been on the train long enough to have drifted off. Some were looking out the windows. None of them looked at Ansel. Not one. Not one head turned toward the brass-bottomed lantern on the shoulder or the engineer standing beside it in the cold. Not one child pointed. Not one adult stopped reading to glance out at the still light of the stopped train on the opposite track. They were, on the look of them, on a train that was going somewhere. They were riding. They were passengers. The train passed. It went on past 2529, standing on the tracks with her headlight burning. It continued east into the dark. Ansel stood on the east shoulder and watched it go. He watched until the tail end of the last car, with its red marker lamps burning, had disappeared into the dark to the east. Then he stood for a moment in the quiet. He turned back to the brass-bottomed kerosene lantern on the west shoulder. The lantern was gone. The shoulder was empty. Ansel walked back to 2529. He climbed the ladder into the cab. He set his own lantern in the rack. He sat in the engineer's seat. Ovid was looking at him. Ovid said, "Cap?" Ansel said, "Did you see that?" Ovid said, "See what, Cap?" Ansel said, "Did you see the train that just passed us?" Ovid said, "Cap, no train has passed us. The block signal ahead is green. The block signal behind us is green. There has been no train through this block for the last 20 minutes at least. What are you telling me?" Ansel looked at Ovid. Then Ansel said, "I am telling you nothing, Ovid. I looked at the lantern. There was no obstruction. We can proceed." Ovid said, "The lantern is still on the shoulder." Ansel said, "No, it is not." Ovid said, "Cap, it is right there." Ansel looked out the side window. The lantern was there, on the west shoulder, lit, steady in the still air. Ansel said, "Ovid, I am going to give her steam. We are moving." He opened the throttle. 2529 began to move. She came up slowly through the gears. 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 42. Ansel looked out the side window as they passed the lantern. The lantern was still there, lit, steady. They passed it in about a second. Ansel did not look back. They finished the run. Ansel filed a report at Havre. He wrote in the report that at milepost 314, at 3:47 a.m., he had observed a lit lantern on the west shoulder of the right-of-way, had stopped the train to investigate, had found no obstruction on the tracks, had returned to the cab, and had proceeded. He had noted the delay to the run at 7 minutes. He had signed the report and had put it in the dispatcher's box. He had not written in the report about the train from 1898. He had not told Ovid about the train. He had not told anyone about the train. He went to his rented room in the boarding house on 3rd Street. He slept. He ate. He worked the evening local. He slept a few hours. He was on the eastbound of number 28 in the morning. On the eastbound at milepost 314, there was no lantern. There was no train. It was daylight. The stretch was the stretch as it always was in daylight. He came home to Grand Forks that evening. Marilee had made a pot roast for supper. Corwin had homework at the kitchen table. Ansel ate. He read the newspaper. He went to bed at 9. He slept badly. In the morning, he did something he had not done in the whole 22 years he had been on the railroad. He drove into Grand Forks to the small public library on 5th Street. He went to the historical section. He asked the librarian, a woman named Miss Ophelia Kramer, whom he had known since Corwin had been a small boy, for the bound files of the Great Northern's operating records from the 1890s. Miss Kramer said, "Ansel, we don't have those. The railroad keeps its own records at the general offices in St. Paul." "Ansel," said Ophelia, "do you have any local newspapers from the 1890s? "From out on the Milk River line," Miss Kramer said. "We have the Grand Forks Herald, back to 1879. For the Milk River line, you'd want the Havre papers, which we don't carry. But sometimes the Herald picked up wire stories about incidents on the line." "What are you looking for?" Ansel said, "I don't know exactly. An accident, maybe. On the line between Wolf Point and Poplar. In the 1890s. Miss Kramer looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Ansel, is this for a story?" Ansel said, "It is for me. I heard some men in the roundhouse talking about a wreck there long ago. I wanted to know if it was true." Miss Kramer said, "All right, let me pull the index." She went into the back. She came out with a bound index volume. She sat with him at a table in the reading room. They looked together for about an hour through the index entries for the Great Northern for the years 1892 through 1900. They found it. A short wire story from the Great Falls Tribune, picked up by the Herald on the 12th of November, 1898. Great Northern westbound passenger train number 9. An 8-car consists, pulled by a Class F8 46O American-type locomotive number 892, had collided at milepost 314 on the Milk River line with a stray Angus bull that had walked onto the tracks in the dark. The locomotive had derailed. The lead coach and the second coach had left the tracks. The other 6 coaches had stayed on the rails. Casualties were the engineer, a man named Wendell Cross of Havre, the fireman, a man named Halden Volstad of Havre, and 11 passengers who had been in the first 2 coaches. 47 passengers in the rear 6 coaches had walked away with minor injuries or none. The wreck had been cleared by the following morning. The line had been reopened by noon on the 13th. Ansel read the story twice. He looked at the names. Wendell Cross, Halden Volstad. 11 passengers, not named. He looked at the locomotive number, 892. He closed the index volume. He thanked Miss Kramer. He drove home. He sat in the kitchen with Marilee's coffee and looked at the pattern of light on the kitchen table from the October sun through the curtains Marilee had made in 1930. He thought that the train he had seen the night before had been the westbound number 9 of 1898, on the run she had been on when she had derailed, with the crew and the passengers she had been carrying when it happened. He thought that she had been running that run at 3:47 in the morning on some pattern he did not understand for 39 years. He thought that Wendell Cross had been the engineer in the cap who had waved to him. He thought about that. He thought that Wendell Cross had been an engineer on the Great Northern who had died on the job at milepost 314 on the 11th of November, 1898, and who was, on some reckoning, still running his train, still waving to the engineers who passed his train on the modern line. He thought that Wendell Cross had waved to him. He thought that he had waved back. He thought that had been the right thing to do. He was back on the westbound of number 27, the next evening. At milepost 314 at 3:47 in the morning, there was no lantern. He kept his eyes on the right-of-way as they passed. There was nothing. They finished the run. He worked the route for the next 9 years. He saw the train from 1898 3 more times. Once in 1940, on the westbound at milepost 314 in the dark of a March morning. The lantern was on the west shoulder. He did not stop this time. He passed at 42 miles an hour. As he passed, he heard, in the dark to the west, the higher-pitched exhaust of the smaller locomotive. He did not look back. Once in 1944, on an eastbound in the daylight, it was on the run of number 28 in the June light of a summer morning. He was through Wolf Point about 8 a.m. and was rolling east. At milepost 314, he saw, on the south side of the tracks, the Class F8460, number 892, standing on a short spur that Ansel knew was an abandoned spur that had been ripped up in 1922. The spur was, on the look of the right-of-way in the daylight, not there. But the locomotive was standing on the rails that were not there. Her carbon arc headlamp was off. Her fire was banked. There was no crew visible in the cab. She was standing the way a locomotive stood on a siding, waiting for the next movement. Ansel passed her at 40 miles an hour. He looked at her as he passed. He did not slow down. The last time was in 1948. It was a November morning, on a westbound, at milepost 314, at 3:47. The lantern was on the west shoulder. Ansel did not stop. He passed at speed. But as he passed, this time, he looked out the side window at the ground around the lantern. There was a man standing beside the lantern. The man was the engineer of the train from 1898. The man in the cap with the mustache and the pale eyes. The man raised his hand in a slow wave. Ansel raised his hand in return. He did not stop. He passed at 42 miles an hour. He looked in the rear view of the cab. The man was gone. The lantern was gone. He finished the run. He never saw the train, or the lantern, or the man again. He retired from the Great Northern in 1955, at the age of 65, after 40 years on the railroad. He lived with Marilee in the house on the street in Grand Forks for another 16 years. Corwin had grown up. Corwin had married a woman named Bethel and had moved to Minneapolis and had children. Ansel and Marilee had grandchildren whom they visited in Minneapolis on the Sundays that Ansel had off, which after his retirement was every Sunday. Ansel died in 1971, at the age of 81, of a stroke at the kitchen table in the house on the street in Grand Forks, while reading the morning newspaper with a cup of coffee in front of him. He never told Marilee about the train. He never told Corwin. He never told any of the engineers he had trained in his last years on the railroad, the young men who had come up through the ranks the way he had come up, and who had taken over the runs he had run for the 29 years he had run them. He carried it alone, sometimes in the evenings in the house, on the street in Grand Forks, after supper. Sitting on the porch in the summer or by the window in the winter, he would think about the train from 1898. He would think about the engineer in the cap with the mustache. He would think about the slow wave. He would think about the consist of wooden coaches with the gold leaf lettering. He would think about the silhouettes of the passengers in the windows, none of them looking at him. He would think about how the train ran, still, on some reckoning, on the Milk River line between Wolf Point and Poplar at 3:47 in the morning on nights when the engineer chose to run her. He would think about where she was going. He would think that she was going east. He would think that she had been going east For however many nights she had been running since the day in 1890-something, when she had run into whatever she had run into that had put her onto the reckoning she was on now. He would think that she would keep going east. He would think that she had never arrived anywhere, that she had never, in the 50 years since Ansel had first seen her, made it to whatever destination she had been going to, that she had been going east for 50 years, and would go east for another 50 years, and another 50 after that. He would think about the engineer raising his hand to Ansel. He would think that the engineer had been asking him something on the occasion of the wave in 1948. Something about whether Ansel would ride with him. Something about whether Ansel would come aboard. Something about whether Ansel would take a consist east from milepost 314 for a while and let the engineer rest. Ansel would think that he was glad he had not stopped. Ansel would think that he would not have known how to stop. Ansel would think that the train from 1898 was on the reckoning, not his to ride. He would think that it was still running, that it would run tonight, that at 3:47 in the morning tonight, at milepost 314, on the Milk River line between Wolf Point and Poplar, in the dark of eastern Montana. The Class F8460 American-type steam locomotive, numbered 892, would come down the tracks from the west at 10 miles an hour, with her carbon arc headlamp burning, and her consist of 8 wooden coaches with the interior lights on and the silhouettes of the passengers in the windows, and would pass whatever train was on the line at that hour, and would continue east into the dark, and would not arrive. He would think that. Then he would go to bed. He would sleep the sleep of a man who had been an engineer on the Great Northern Railway for 40 years, and who had seen on that railway one thing that no one else he had known had ever seen, and who had carried the thing well. He would wake in the morning. He would have his coffee at the kitchen table. He would read the newspaper. He would live the rest of his life. And out on the Milk River line, between the mileposts, in the dark of a Montana October, at 3:47 in the morning, the Class F8460 American-type steam locomotive, numbered 892, would come down the tracks from the west at 10 miles an hour, with her carbon arc headlamp burning, and her consist of 8 wooden coaches with the interior lights on and the silhouettes of the passengers at the windows, and her engineer at the wheel in his cap with the pipe in his mouth. She would come to milepost 314. She would pass. She would continue east into the dark. She would not arrive. She was running now. She would be running tomorrow. And on some tomorrow, some engineer of some future train would stop and would climb down onto the ballast and would see the lantern on the shoulder and would look east into the dark and would know what he was looking at and would raise his hand. And the man in the cap would raise his hand in return. And the train would go on. Dr. Eliza Farthing was 58 years old and had been the sole physician of Cavendish County, Vermont, for 30 years. And on a Thursday afternoon in October 2026, when her patient Ottilie Wren left the office for the drive home, she watched from the window and understood, for the first time in the 30 years, what had been happening at the bend of Route 100 north of the office all along. She had come to Cavendish County in the summer of 1996. She had come to take over the family practice. Her father, Dr. Ambrose Farthing, had run out of the same small yellow clapboard house on Main Street in the village of Cavendish for 34 years before her. Ambrose had been 68 when he had decided to retire. He had written to Eliza in her second year of her residency at Dartmouth Hitchcock in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and had said that if she wanted to practice, she was welcome to it, and that if she did not, he would sell the practice to whichever young physician the State Medical Association could find for the county. Eliza had written back and had said she would take the practice. She had come home to Cavendish that summer. She had, in the 30 years since, run the practice out of the same yellow clapboard house on Main Street. She had a waiting room in the front parlor, an examining room in the back parlor, a small office off the hallway that had been her father's study when she had been a girl, and a small laboratory off the kitchen where she ran the basic blood work and the urinalyses that a rural practice did in-house. She had a nurse, a woman named Priscilla Ockeridge, who had been her father's nurse for the last 12 years of his practice, and had stayed on for Eliza, and was now 74 years old, and had, in the last few years, begun to talk about retirement. Eliza was not married. She had come close, twice, once in her 20s, to a fellow resident at Dartmouth, and once in her early 40s to a lawyer from Woodstock. But neither had worked out for reasons she had, at the time, thought were important, and now, on the reckoning of a woman of 58, thought were mostly reasons of her own making. She lived in the second floor of the yellow clapboard house, in the 2 rooms and bath that had been her bedroom and her father's bedroom when she had been a girl. She kept an old spaniel named Roscoe on the porch in summer, and in the kitchen in winter. She was, on the outside look of a woman in a rural New England county. Alone, she was not. On the inside reckoning, unhappy, she was. On the inside reckoning, exactly the kind of doctor she had come home to be. She knew every one of the 411 families in Cavendish County by name. She knew the names of the children, the names of the grandmothers, the names of the dogs. She knew who was well and who was sick. She knew who was drinking too much and who had stopped. She knew which of the marriages were sound and which were coming apart. She knew where the money was and where it wasn't. She knew which of the elderly patients would be gone by spring and which would live another 10 years. She knew, in the way a rural doctor comes to know her patients over 30 years of house calls and office visits and late-night phone calls. Everything that could reasonably be known about the people who lived in the valleys and hollows and hill farms of a rural Vermont county of about 1,800 souls. She loved her patients. She loved them in the way a woman of her temperament and background loved her work, quietly, without display, in the everyday form of being available when she was needed, and being clear when the news was hard, and being careful with the small dignities that a rural doctor could give her patients when she could not give them anything else. She was, on the reckoning of the people of Cavendish County, the doctor. The office hours were 9 to 4, Monday through Friday, plus evening hours on Tuesdays and Saturday mornings, when needed. Eliza took house calls in the evenings and on Sundays, and at any hour of the night when a patient called. She had, in her 30 years, missed the Sunday drive back from a wedding in Boston to be at the bedside of a patient who was dying in Cavendish Falls. She had missed the opening of the art gallery in Woodstock. Her college roommate had opened in 2007 to attend a 57th birthday party at the home of a patient who had told her on her last office visit that she wasn't sure she would live to see her 58th. She had missed the things a person misses in the life of a rural doctor, and she had, on the reckoning of a woman of 58, no regrets about any of it. Adelie Wren was, on the afternoon in October, 73 years old. She had been Eliza's patient for the whole 30 years. She had been Ambrose's patient for the 22 years before that. She had been born in Cavendish County in 1953, in the same yellow clapboard house on Main Street where Eliza now practiced, at a time when the house had still had the small delivery room in the back bedroom that Ambrose had used for the home births he had attended before the county hospital in Ludlow had opened in the 60s. Ottilie lived on a small hill farm on Route 100, about 4 miles north of the village. She had lived on the farm her whole life. Her husband, Kestrel, had died in 2019 of a stroke at the age of 68. Her 2 children, a son named Wren and a daughter named Marley, both lived in Rutland, an hour and a half to the west, and both had families of their own, and both came out to see Ottilie every other weekend or so. Ottilie kept a small flock of laying hens and a small vegetable garden and an old border collie named Halden, and she was, in the reckoning of Eliza's patient files, in generally good health for a woman of her age. She had come in that Thursday for a follow-up on a medication adjustment for her blood pressure. The appointment had been at 2:30. Eliza had seen her for about 40 minutes. They had talked, in the way Eliza and Ottilie had talked in their office visits for 30 years, about the medication and also about Ottilie's grandchildren, and about the harvest that year on the hill, and about the autumn color on the ridges of the hills above Cavendish Falls. Eliza had adjusted the medication. She had written the new prescription. She had walked Ottilie to the door at 3:15. Ottilie had said, "Eliza, thank you." Eliza had said, "Drive careful, Ottilie. Route 100 is going to be shady at this hour." Ottilie had said, "I know, I always am." Eliza had watched her walk to her old Subaru wagon in the parking lot beside the yellow clapboard house. She had watched Ottilie back the Subaru out of the parking lot. She had watched Ottilie turn north on Main Street toward the intersection with Route 100. She had watched Ottilie's taillights disappear around the bend at the edge of the village, where the road curved to the right into the trees. Then, Eliza had gone back into the office. She had sat down at her desk in the small office off the hallway. She had thought about Ottilie. She had thought about what she had not told Ottilie, which was that the blood work Eliza had done at the last office visit 2 weeks earlier had come back with numbers that suggested that Ottilie was, on the reckoning of Eliza's 30 years of practice, in the early stages of pancreatic cancer. Eliza had not told her because Eliza was not yet sure. The numbers were suggestive but not conclusive. Eliza had ordered a set of imaging studies at the hospital in Ludlow, which Ottilie was scheduled to have on the following Wednesday. The imaging would tell them for certain, one way or the other. Eliza had, in the way she had learned to do in her 30 years, decided to wait for the imaging before she said anything to Ottilie. If the imaging was negative, there would be no reason to have upset Ottilie for 2 weeks. If the imaging was positive, Eliza would have Ottilie in the office the following Thursday and would tell her then, and would begin the conversations about the things that would need to happen next. Eliza was, sitting at her desk at 3:18 on the Thursday afternoon, aware that the imaging on the following Wednesday was almost certainly going to be positive. She was aware that she was, in the way of a rural doctor with a long-time patient, already grieving Ottilie in the quiet way she had learned to grieve her patients ahead of the bad news. She was aware also of the small, unusual things she had done for 30 years at the end of appointments with patients she was worried about. She had, over the 30 years, gotten in the habit of watching those patients drive away from the office. She had not thought much about the habit. She had, if she had thought about it, told herself she was doing it as a small dispatch, as a way of sending them on their way home, with the quiet attention of the doctor who had just seen them. She had told herself it was a kind of prayer, of a rural New England Protestant kind that Eliza did not really believe in, but had grown up around, and had grown into the habit of. She would stand at the window of her small office off the hallway. The window looked north, up Main Street, out toward the intersection with Route 100. She would watch the patient's car turn out of the office parking lot onto Main. She would watch the car go north on Main. She would watch the car turn right onto Route 100. She would watch the car until the tail lights disappeared around the bend at the edge of the village, where the road curved into the trees. Then she would go back to her desk. She had done this over the 30 years with hundreds of patients. Every patient about whom she was worried in a way. Every patient with a diagnosis, a test result. A quiet knowledge Eliza had of what was probably coming. Got the small ceremony of Eliza watching them go. Ottilie had, on that Thursday afternoon, gotten the ceremony. Eliza had watched her all the way to the bend at the edge of the village. She had watched the taillights disappear around the bend. She had, at the moment, she watched the taillights disappear, seen something else. She had seen, at the bend of Route 100, where the road curved into the trees, a figure standing at the edge of the road. The figure was of an old woman. The woman was in a dark coat and a dark scarf tied over her hair. She was standing at the shoulder of the road at the point where the road curved. She was looking down the road toward the village. Her hands were folded in front of her. Eliza had, at the moment she saw the woman, thought at first that she was seeing a real person, a pedestrian on Route 100, standing at the shoulder, waiting for a ride, or looking for a dropped item, or doing one of the ordinary things that a woman on a rural road might be doing. Then Eliza had seen that the woman was not a real person. The woman was, on the look of her from the window of the small office at the yellow clapboard house on Main Street in the village of Cavendish, Vermont. 300 yards away, and looking north up the road, the figure of a woman Eliza had seen every time she had watched a patient drive around that bend for 30 years. She had never noticed her before. She had, on the reckoning of a woman of 58, who had spent 30 years looking out that window at that bend, at that edge of the village, been looking past the woman. She had, on the afternoon in October when she was watching Ottilie Wren drive away with a suspected diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, seen the woman for the first time. The woman was standing at the bend. The woman was watching Ottilie's Subaru come around the bend. The Subaru went around the bend. Ottilie could not, from the driver's seat of a Subaru in the angle of the afternoon light, have seen the woman standing at the shoulder. But the woman was watching the car. Eliza saw the woman turn as the car passed and follow it with her eyes. The woman's gaze was on the rear of the car. She was looking at the driver's side of the vehicle. She was looking, on Eliza's read from 300 yards, at Ottilie. Then the woman looked away. The Subaru went on around the bend. The woman stayed at the shoulder. Eliza stood at the window and watched the woman for a long moment. The woman was still there. Eliza turned and went to the front of the house. She walked out the front door onto the porch. She looked north up Main Street toward the bend. The woman was gone. The bend was empty. The trees on either side of Route 100 stood in the October color of the late afternoon. The stretch of road curving into the trees was empty. There was no one there. Eliza went back into the office. She sat at her desk. She thought about the woman. She was, on the reckoning of a physician of 30 years, aware that she had just seen something that was not. On the medical reckoning of a physician, there, she was aware that this was the kind of thing that, if it had been reported to her by a patient, she would have written down in her notes as a possible sign of an onset of a dementia, or of a medication reaction, or of a stroke. She was aware that she was 58 years old and had, in the standard reckoning of the medical assessments she had done on herself, no signs of any of the above. She was aware, therefore, that she had seen a real thing. She thought about the woman. She thought about the way the woman had looked at Ottilie's Subaru as it had come around the bend. She thought about the way the woman had followed the car with her eyes. She thought. She got up from her desk. She walked into her small office off the hallway. She looked out the window at the bend. The bend was empty. She sat down at her desk. She opened the patient file for Ottilie Wren. She wrote a note in the file. The note read, 3:15 p.m. PT, departed office. Watched. Imaging scheduled for WED. Will follow up. Then she wrote a second note below the first. The second note read, woman at bend. Watched. PT. Not there when I went to check. She looked at the second note for a moment. Then she closed the file. She did the rest of her afternoon appointments. She saw 2 more patients between 3:30 and 4:15. A young mother with a colicky infant and an older man who had come in for a refill on an inhaler prescription. She saw both patients in the normal way. She did not, on the reckoning of either patient, seem different. At 4:30, she left the office. She drove to Route 100. She drove north on Route 100 to the bend at the edge of the village. She pulled her car onto the shoulder at the point where she had seen the woman. She got out. She stood on the shoulder for a long time. The ground under her feet was the dirt of a rural Vermont road shoulder in October. There was no footprint in the dirt. There was no evidence of anyone having stood there. The trees along the shoulder were the ordinary trees of the Vermont woods: maple, birch, hemlock, a stand of white pine on the east side of the road. She stood. She looked down the road toward the village. She could see, 300 yards away, the yellow clapboard house on Main Street. She could see the window of her small office off the hallway. She could see, from this angle, that the window had a clear line of sight to exactly the spot she was standing on. She thought about the view. She thought about the woman. She thought about how the woman had, on the afternoon in October, been standing on exactly this spot on the shoulder at exactly the moment Ottilie had come around the bend. She thought about how the woman had been standing on this spot on other afternoons. For the whole 30 years, Eliza had been watching her patients drive away from the office. She thought about how she had not seen the woman before that afternoon. She thought about why she was seeing her now. She thought. Then she got in her car. She drove back to the village. She parked at the yellow clapboard house. She went into the office. She was, on the outside reckoning, an ordinary rural doctor at the end of an ordinary Thursday. She had a bowl of soup for supper. She read the medical journal that had come in the afternoon mail. She went to bed at 10. She did not sleep. For the next 3 weeks, Eliza watched. She watched every patient who left her office. She stood at the small office window and watched them turn out of the parking lot onto Main. She watched them turn onto Route 100. She watched them go around the bend. She watched to see if the woman was there. The woman was not always there. The woman was there on the occasions when Eliza had, on the reckoning of her 30 years of practice, a worry about the patient. She was there on the afternoon Eliza saw an old man named Werner Holloway, who had come in for a follow-up on the congestive heart failure Eliza had diagnosed in the summer. She was there on the morning Eliza saw a middle-aged woman named Perpetua Grimm, who had come in for a consultation on a breast lump that Eliza was, on the reckoning of her physical exam, certain was malignant. She was not there on the afternoons Eliza saw patients Eliza was not worried about. She was not there for the colicky infants and the inhaler refills and the routine physicals and the well child visits. She was there only for the patients whose outlook Eliza was quietly worried about. Eliza watched. She was, on the reckoning of a physician of 30 years, careful. She did not tell anyone. She did not tell Priscilla Ockridge. She did not tell the cardiologist in Ludlow with whom she had been consulting on Werner Holloway. She did not tell her old college roommate whom she called on the Sunday afternoons. She watched. She saw the woman at the bend about once every 4 or 5 days. The woman was always in the dark coat and the dark scarf. She was always standing on the same spot on the shoulder. She was always watching the patient's car come around the bend. She never approached the car. She never signaled. She never did anything except watch. Sometimes, as the car went past, the woman would, in the slow way she had, lift her right hand from where it was folded in front of her and would touch the back of her left hand with the fingers of her right, and would then return her hands to the folded position in front of her. That was the only movement Eliza ever saw her make. Eliza did not know what the gesture meant. But she noted. In the patient files she was keeping on the patients whose cars the woman had watched, that the patients who had received the gesture were the patients whose diagnoses Eliza had, in her quiet worry, considered the most serious. Werner Holloway had, on the Tuesday of the first week, been in the office for his follow-up. Werner was 79. He had been a dairy farmer on the west side of the county for the whole of his life, and had sold the herd in 2015 when his knees had given out, and had been living on the reduced income of a rural retiree in an old farmhouse he could not afford to heat properly since. His congestive heart failure had progressed through the summer. Eliza had, at the Tuesday appointment, told him that they were coming to the point where they would need to have a conversation about a higher level of care. Werner had understood. He had sat in the examining chair with his hands on his knees and had said, "Eliza, I know. I have known for a while. Do not soften it for me." She had not softened it. She had told him what she thought. He had thanked her. She had watched him drive away. His car, an old blue Ford Ranger pickup he had bought in '98 and had never replaced, had gone north on Maine. It had turned onto Route 100. It had come around the bend. The woman had been at the shoulder. She had watched the Ranger come around. She had lifted her right hand. She had touched the back of her left hand with the fingers of her right. She had returned her hands to the folded position in front of her. Werner had gone on north. He had died 6 weeks later, at home, in his own bed. In the quiet way a man of that generation and background sometimes died, his daughter had come out from Springfield on the Saturday and had made him supper and had put him to bed at 9 and had checked on him at 11 and found him gone. Eliza had signed the death certificate. She had gone to the funeral at the Congregational Church in Cavendish Falls the following Wednesday. She had stood at the graveside in the November cold and had thought about the woman at the bend, and had thought that on some reckoning, the woman had been walking with Werner for the 6 weeks of his going. Perpetua Grimm was 54. She had come in on the Thursday morning of the second week. She had felt the lump herself on a Sunday and had waited 3 days before calling for an appointment because she had wanted, in the way of a woman of her temperament, to be certain she was not overreacting. She was a school librarian at the middle school in the village. She had 2 teenage children and a husband named Boyd who taught social studies at the same school. She had come in without Boyd because she had not wanted to alarm him until she had known for certain. Eliza had done the exam. She had known, on the reckoning of 30 years, before she had gotten to the second breast, what she was going to find. She had ordered the mammogram and the biopsy at the hospital in Ludlow. She had, in the way she had learned to do, not said anything definitive to Perpetua. She had said the words that a rural doctor said to a middle-aged patient in that situation. "Perpetua, we will get you in for the imaging as soon as possible. I do not want to speculate before we have the pictures. Let's not tell Boyd anything yet. Let's wait for the imaging." Perpetua had said, "Eliza, do you think it is bad?" Eliza had said, "Perpetua, I do not know, but I want to be careful. Let us get the pictures." Perpetua had left the office at 11:15. Eliza had watched her drive away. Perpetua's car, a gray Honda Car-V, had gone north on Maine. It had turned onto Route 100. It had come around the bend. The woman had been at the shoulder. She had watched. She had lifted her hand. She had made the gesture. Perpetua had gone on north. The imaging had come back positive. The biopsy had confirmed. Perpetua had, over the course of the winter and the spring, gone through the rounds of the chemotherapy at the oncology center in Lebanon. She was, at that point, still alive, and, on the most recent reckoning, in a remission that might hold for years or might not. Eliza had watched her drive away from every appointment during the difficult months. The woman had been at the bend for every one. She noted, in the patient files, that on the afternoon Adelie Wren's imaging had come back, and Eliza had, on the following Thursday, called Adelie into the office and told her about the pancreatic cancer. Adelie had walked out of the office in the stunned quiet of a woman who had been given news that had everything to do with the rest of her life. Eliza had watched Adelie from the small office window. Adelie had driven north on Main. Adelie had turned right on Route 100. Adelie had come around the bend. The woman had been there. The woman had watched Adelie's Subaru come around the bend. The woman had, as the car had passed, lifted her right hand from where it was folded in front of her, and had touched the back of her left hand with the fingers of her right, and had returned her hands to the folded position in front of her. Then the woman had done something Eliza had not seen her do before. The woman had turned. The woman had walked away up the shoulder of Route 100, following the Subaru north. The woman had walked slowly, the way an old woman in a dark coat and a dark scarf walked, and had gone up the road behind the car, and had disappeared into the trees where the road bent to the west into the hills above Cavendish Falls. Eliza had watched from her window. She had understood. She had understood. In the quiet way a person of her temperament came to understandings, that the woman at the bend was going with Adelie, that the woman was going to walk beside the road that Adelie's car was driving on, that the woman was going to be with Adelie for the drive home, and for the days and weeks after, and for whatever stretch of time Adelie had left. That the woman was, on the reckoning of whatever the woman was, a kind of accompaniment for the patients Eliza had, in her quiet worry, sent home with the bad news. Eliza had sat at her desk for a long time. She had thought about the woman. She had thought about who the woman might have been in the long ago, and about how the woman had come to be at the bend of Route 100, and about what the gesture meant, and about what the accompaniment did for the patients who were, on the reckoning of the doctor and the woman together, receiving it. She had not known. She had not, on the reckoning of a physician of 30 years, needed to know. She had understood that the woman was doing a kind of work that Eliza herself did not do. Eliza did the work of the medicine, the diagnosis, the treatment, the management of the illness, the quiet keeping company of a rural doctor with her patients through the hardest stretches of their lives. The woman at the bend did the other work. The other work was the accompaniment. It was the walking with. It was the quiet presence at the shoulder of the road on the afternoon the patient drove home with the bad news. It was the gesture, the touch of the right hand to the back of the left, that Eliza did not understand, but that seemed, on the reckoning of the patients who had received it, to be a comfort. Eliza had understood that the woman had been doing the other work for the whole 30 years Eliza had been watching her patients drive around the bend. And for the 34 years, Ambrose had been watching his patients drive around the bend before Eliza. And probably for the much longer time before that. She had understood that Cavendish County had, in the long reckoning, 2 healers. One was Eliza. One was the woman at the bend. She had understood that the 2 of them had, on the reckoning of the county, been working together, without knowing it. for a long time. Eliza sat at her desk in the small office off the hallway. She thought about Adelie. She thought about how Adelie was, at that moment, driving home to the small hill farm on Route 100 with the news of the pancreatic cancer. She thought about how the woman at the bend was, at that moment, walking up Route 100 beside the Subaru. She thought about how Adelie would not, on the reckoning of a woman driving her own car home with the news, see the woman. But the woman would be there. Eliza thought that was a good thing. She thought that was, on the reckoning of a physician of 30 years who had watched her patients drive away from her office with the bad news for the whole of those 30 years. The best thing that could be true. She got up. She walked into the waiting room. She sat down in the armchair by the fireplace in the parlor and thought about the view from the small office window and about the bend of Route 100 and about the old woman in the dark coat and the dark scarf and about how she had been there the whole time. She was, in the quiet, at peace. She was going to continue her practice. She was going to continue watching her patients drive away from the office. She was going to continue sending the patients about whom she was worried out onto the stretch of Route 100, where the woman waited. She was going to continue the work. The woman would continue the other work. Between the two of them, the patients of Cavendish County would be on the long reckoning, not alone. Adelie's decline through the winter was, on the reckoning of a rural doctor of 30 years, about what Eliza had expected. Adelie had gone to Lebanon for the initial consultations with the oncologist in early November. She had come back to Cavendish with the treatment plan. She had, in the way of a Vermont woman of her generation and background, taken the news and the treatment plan and had put them in the corner of her mind where she put things she was going to deal with, and had gone back to her hens and her garden and her border collie and her grandchildren, and had continued to live her life while the treatment went on around her. Eliza saw her every 2 weeks through the winter. They talked in the office about the pain management and the appetite and the fatigue, and about the small logistical questions of a woman who was managing her own decline in a small rural house on a hill. They talked about Wren and Marley and the grandchildren. They talked about what Adelie wanted to do with the farm. They talked about the arrangements Adelie was making, the will she was updating with the lawyer in Woodstock, the things she was putting aside for each of the grandchildren, the letters she was writing to be given to them after she was gone. They talked once, in the second week of February, about what Adelie wanted at the end. Adelie said, "Eliza, I want to be at home." Eliza said, "Adelie, you can be at home. I will come out." Adelie said, "I know you will." Eliza said, "Wren and Marley will come too, when it is time." Adelie said, "I know they will." They sat for a moment in the office in the yellow clapboard house on Main Street. The February afternoon was gray outside the window. There was snow on the ground in the parking lot. Adelie said, "Eliza." Eliza said, "Yes." Adelie said, "There's a thing I have been meaning to tell you." Eliza said, "Tell me." Adelie said, "On the drive home from the office. On the afternoon you told me. And on the drives home since. I have been feeling, in the car, at the bend where the road turns into the trees just north of the village, that there is someone in the car with me." Eliza held very still. Eliza said, Adelie said, "I do not know how else to say it. It is not a person. It is a presence. I feel it in the passenger seat. It is there for the bend, and it is there for about a mile after the bend. Then it goes." Eliza said, "Are you frightened of it?" Adelie said, "No. It is a kind presence. It is like sitting in the car with someone who knows what I am carrying and who is willing to sit with me for a while. It has been there for every drive home since you told me. Eliza said. Ottilie said. I thought I was making it up at first. I thought it was the medication or the fear, but it has been the same every time. It sits with me. It does not say anything. Then at about the mile past the bend it goes, and I am alone in the car again. Eliza said, Ottilie, I want to tell you something. Ottilie said, tell me. Eliza said, I have been seeing a woman at that bend for a few months now. She stands on the shoulder. She watches the cars of my patients I am worried about drive past. She makes a small gesture. She has been at the bend for, I think, a long time. I do not know who she is. I do not know when she came. I have not spoken to her. But I think what you are feeling in the car is her. I think she gets in with you at the bend and she rides with you for about a mile. Ottilie was quiet for a moment. Then Ottilie said, Eliza, thank you for telling me. Eliza said, thank you for telling me too, Ottilie. I have been alone with this since October. Ottilie said, you are not alone with it. I am with you now. I know. They sat. Then Ottilie said, Eliza, when it is time, do you think she will come inside? Eliza said, Ottilie, I do not know. Ottilie said, I hope she does. Ottilie died on the 22nd of April at her house on Route 100 at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Wren and Marley were with her. Eliza had been out that morning to check on her and had left about noon to make her afternoon rounds. Wren called Eliza at 3:10. Eliza came back out. She pronounced Ottilie in the front bedroom of the small hill farm. Eliza sat with Wren and Marley in the kitchen for about an hour. They drank coffee. They talked about Ottilie in the quiet way a family talks about a mother who has just gone. Then Eliza drove back to the village. She drove south on Route 100. At the bend coming into the village from the north, she was aware of a presence in the passenger seat of her own car. She did not turn to look. She kept her eyes on the road. She said quietly, in the car, thank you for being with her. The presence stayed for about a mile. Then it was gone. Eliza came back into the village. She parked at the yellow clapboard house. She went inside. She sat at her desk in the small office off the hallway. She wrote up the death certificate for Ottilie Wren. She filed it. She sat at her desk. She looked out the window at the bend of Route 100. The bend was empty. She thought about Ottilie. She thought about what Ottilie had said in February, about the presence in the car, about hoping the presence would come inside. She thought that Ottilie had not been alone, that the woman had come inside at the end, that whatever work the woman at the bend had done, it had been done for Ottilie all the way through. She was at her desk in the small office off the hallway, in the quiet. Eliza did not tell anyone else. She did not tell Priscilla. She did not tell her college roommate. She did not tell her brother in Boston. She did not tell any of the physicians she consulted with in Ludlow or in Lebanon or in Burlington. She carried it alone from Ottilie onward, the knowing of it hers and Ottilie's, and Ottilie was gone. Sometimes at night, in her bedroom on the second floor of the yellow clapboard house, with Roscoe asleep on the rug at the foot of the bed, she would lie awake and think about the woman. She would think about who the woman had been. She would think about when the woman had first come to the bend. She would think about whether the woman had been someone who had lived in Cavendish County long ago and had lost her own loved ones on the drive home from the old office of some earlier doctor in the village, and had, on some reckoning of her own grief, taken up the vigil at the bend so that no one else would have to make that drive alone. She would think that, maybe. She would think that she would not know. She would think that she did not, on the reckoning of a physician who had come to understand that she was not the only healer in the county, need to know. She would think about Ottilie. She would think about Werner Holloway, and Perpetua Grimm, and the dozen other patients who had received the gesture from the woman at the bend since Eliza had first started seeing her. She would think that they were, in the reckoning, being accompanied. She would think that was a good thing. She would sleep. She would wake up in the morning. She would go downstairs. She would put on the coffee. She would sit at the kitchen table, with Roscoe at her feet. She would look out the kitchen window at the October light on the back garden. She would go to the office at 9. She would see her patients. She would watch the ones about whom she was worried drive away. She would watch them go around the bend. And on some of those afternoons, standing at the small office window in the yellow clapboard house on Main Street, in the village of Cavendish, Eliza would raise her own hand, the way the woman raised hers, the fingers of the right touching the back of the left, held for a moment against the glass. The woman at the bend would not see it. The 300 yards were too far. The angle was wrong. Eliza knew that. She did it anyway. It was, on some reckoning, what one healer could offer another, across a stretch of road in a small Vermont county, on an autumn afternoon in the light. The woman would go on standing at the bend, and the patient in the car, who could see neither of them, would drive on north, with the color of the maples coming down onto the hood, and would come around the bend, and would feel someone in the seat beside her. Someone who knew, and who had come to sit with her for a while, and who would stay for the mile. Riola Kestrel was 61 years old, and had been the overnight tender of the Rothley Street drawbridge over the Fox River in De Pere, Wisconsin, for 34 years, and on the third Tuesday of June, 2026, at 3:14 in the morning, she watched the Wooden Lake tug pass under her raised bridge for what she came to understand, over the course of the summer that followed, had been the 12,000th time or so. She had come to the bridge in the summer of 1992. She had come to it from a job at the paper mill on the west side of De Pere, where she had worked for 6 years after high school, doing the overnight cleaning of the finishing floor of the mill on a 12-hour shift that had, in the 6th year, begun to be too much for her back. She had, at the age of 27, gone to the city offices on the ground floor of the old brick city hall on Broadway Street to ask about other work, and had been told by the clerk that the Public Works Department was hiring a tender for the overnight shift on the Rothley Street Bridge. She had gone that afternoon to see the supervisor of the Public Works Department, an old man named Werner Halloway, who was 3 years from his own retirement. He had shown her the bridge and the tender's booth and the control panel and the logbook. He had asked her 3 questions. He had hired her on the spot. She had trained for 6 weeks on the day shift with a tender named Millicent Ovard, who had been the day tender for 11 years, and who taught her the procedures for the various kinds of traffic that came up the river. She had started the overnight on the first Monday of August, 1992. She had worked the overnight ever since. The Rothley Street Bridge was a small single-leaf bascule bridge of the Scherzer rolling lift type that had been built in 1908 by the engineering firm of Scherzer and Company of Chicago. It had been in continuous service on the Fox River between the east and west sides of downtown De Pere for 118 years. It was, on the State Historical Register, a structure of historical significance. It had been retrofitted several times over the years. The original steam-powered lifting mechanism had been converted to electric in 1931. The original wooden deck had been replaced with steel plate in 1952. The control panel had been modernized in 1987 and again in 2011. But the bridge itself was still the bridge Scherzer had built. It carried Rothley Street, a two-lane city street, over the navigable channel of the lower Fox River. When it was down, it took the weight of the traffic on the street. When it was up, it left a vertical clearance of 41 feet over the channel, which was enough for the commercial and pleasure traffic that used the section of the river between the De Pere Lock and the mouth of the river at Green Bay. The bridge went up, on the average of the year, about 14 times a day. Most of the traffic was pleasure. The sport fishing boats going out to Green Bay in the early mornings and coming back in the late afternoons. The sailboats coming up from the yacht harbor in Green Bay for the weekends on the stretches of the river above the lock. Some was commercial. The working boats of the commercial fishermen who still ran a handful of nets in the bay. The service boats of the various industrial and municipal operations on the river. On the overnight shift, the traffic was almost always commercial or specific. Riola tended the overnight shift from midnight to 8 in the morning, Monday through Friday. Her partner on the day shift, currently a woman in her 40s, named Halcyon Vroom, who had come to the bridge in 2015 after her own career change, worked 8 to 4. A third tender worked 4 to midnight. Together they covered the 24-hour operation of the bridge, which was, on the reckoning of the navigable waterway rules of the United States Coast Guard, required to be tended at all hours. The overnight shift was quiet. On the average of the year, Riola raised the bridge about 2 times a night. Some nights it was 3 or 4. Some nights it was none. The overnight traffic was almost always commercial. A tug pushing a barge of corn or fuel oil up to the paper mill above the lock. A service boat coming down from the De Pere Yacht Harbor to work on a navigation buoy in the bay. A commercial fishing boat coming back from a late run. Riola knew, on the reckoning of 34 years, every overnight boat on the river. She knew the tug of Fox River Marine Services, which was named the Halden, and which was skippered by a man named Werner Karsten, who had been on the boat for the whole 34 years Riola had been on the bridge. Riola and Werner had a quiet arrangement of radio calls. Werner would call up on the Marine radio channel about 15 minutes before he got to the bridge. Would say, roughly, "This is the Halden, coming up on you at 0230. Request lift," and Riola would say, "Halden, this is Rothley. Copy. We'll lift on your call." Werner would call again as he came into visual range of the bridge. Riola would raise the bridge. Werner would pass under with the slow chug of the old tug and would give a small toot of his whistle to say thank you. Riola would lower the bridge. She would enter the pass in her logbook. That was one pass. She knew the service boats of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which came down the river about once a week in the summer months and about once a month in the winter. She knew the tug of the Green Bay Metro Sanitary Sewerage District, which came up the river on occasions to work on the outfalls above the lock. She knew the pleasure boats that occasionally came through in the late hours of Friday nights and Saturday nights, the fishermen coming back late from the bay, the sailors returning from the evening cruises on the lake. She knew, in the way a bridge tender came to know the traffic on the navigable waterway she tended over 34 years. All of it, except for the tug that came through every night at 3:14. She had not, in the whole 34 years, thought about the tug that came through every night at 3:14. She had, in the whole 34 years, raised the bridge for it about 12,000 times. She had not, in the whole 34 years, made an entry in her logbook for a single one of the 12,000 passes. She had not, in the whole 34 years, wondered what the tug was. She had not thought about it at all. That was the thing she came to understand. On the summer of 2026, at the age of 61, on her 34th year on the bridge. She had been married to Boyd for 31 of those years. She had met him in 1994, 2 years after she had come to the bridge, at a fish fry at the Knights of Columbus Hall on Broadway Street on a Friday night in Lent. Boyd had been 30 then. He had been a millwright at the paper mill on the west side, doing the maintenance of the finishing floor machinery that Riola had been cleaning in her old job. They had known some of the same people. They had gone out to breakfast the following Sunday. They had been married in September of the following year. They had, on the reckoning of a couple who had not had children and had not particularly wanted to, made a quiet life together in a small house on 6th Street, on the east side of De Pere, 3 blocks from the bridge. She had, over the 31 years of the marriage, worked overnight, and Boyd had worked days. They had seen each other for the hours between his coming home at 4 and her leaving for the shift at 11:40. They had eaten supper together every evening. They had, on the weekends when she was off, spent whole days at home together, doing the small tasks of a small house in a small city. They had been, on the reckoning of Riola at 61 looking back, happy. Boyd had retired from the mill in 2022. Riola had thought about retiring then, to be with him during his days. She had not, in the end. She had been 57. She had liked the shift. She had liked the quiet of the booth. She had liked the paperbacks, and the coffee, and the fan, in the summer window, and the way the light came up over the east side of the city at about 5 in the morning in June and about 7 in December. She had told Boyd she would go another 5 years, until she was 62. Boyd had said all right. She had been aware, that summer of 2026, that the 5 years were coming up. She had been aware that she had, in a certain way, been beginning to look at her shift as a thing she was going to leave. She wondered later whether that was why she had, on the 3rd Tuesday of June, become aware of what she had been doing at 3:14 every night for 34 years. Whether the tug had, on some reckoning of its own, wanted her to know before she left. Whether the tug had been able to tell that she was thinking about leaving, and had, in the way of an arrangement that had been in place for a long time, wanted the tender, who had been raising the bridge, for it to have the knowledge of the work she had done. She wondered. She did not know. It started on the 3rd Tuesday of June. She was at the tender's booth at 3:14 in the morning. The tender's booth was a small structure on the south side of the bridge, about 8 feet by 10 feet inside, with windows on all 4 sides, so the tender could see the approach from either direction on the street and the approach from either direction on the river. It was equipped with a control panel for the bridge lift, the radio for the Marine Channel, and the City Dispatch Channel, a logbook, a coffee pot, an electric heater for the winter, and a fan for the summer, and a chair that had, on the reckoning of the back of a woman who had spent 34 years in it, become specifically formed to the shape of Riola's body. She was reading a book. The book was a paperback mystery novel of the kind she read on the overnight shift. She went through about 2 a week, and had, on the reckoning of the used bookstore in Green Bay, from which she bought them, gone through more than 3,000 of them over the years. At 3:13, she looked up from the book and set it down on the counter beside the chair, and stood up. She walked to the control panel. She put her hand on the lever that raised the bridge. She raised the bridge. The bridge came up in the slow way it always came up. The bascule leaf rose from the horizontal at the rate of about 2 feet per second, pivoting on the rolling lift trunnion at the east end of the bridge, until at 40, 1 feet of vertical clearance, the lift arms cut off, and the bridge stood at its raised position, with the leaf pointing at the eastern sky. At 3:14, a tug passed under the bridge. Riola watched it pass. It was a wooden lake tug of a style that had not been built since the 1940s. She had seen photographs of tugs like it in a historical exhibit at the Neville Public Museum in Green Bay that she had visited on an afternoon of her 50th birthday in 2015. The tug was about 60 feet long, with a wooden hull painted a dark green, with a single tall pilot house painted white, and a single stack rising from the center of the pilot house. The tug was moving at about 4 knots. It was not pushing a barge. It was not towing anything. It was moving up the river on its own. There was a man in the pilot house. Riola could see him through the windows of the pilot house in the glow of the pilot house light. He was wearing a dark cap. He had a pipe in his mouth. His hands were on the wheel. He was looking straight ahead up the river. He did not look up at the bridge as he passed under. Riola watched him pass. The tug went under the bridge and continued upriver toward the lock. Riola stood at the control panel. She put her hand on the lever. She lowered the bridge. The bridge came down in the slow way it always came down. It came to rest at the horizontal at exactly 3:15 and 22 seconds, which was on the reckoning of a bridge tender who had raised and lowered the bridge about 25,000 times over 34 years. The exact time it took to lower the bridge from its raised position. Riola walked back to the chair. She sat down. She picked up the book. She was about to open it when she stopped. She stopped because she had, on the reckoning of a woman who had been sitting at that control panel for 34 years, just realized something. She had just raised the bridge for a tug. She had not, in the way she raised the bridge for a commercial boat, received a radio call from the skipper. She had not been told a tug was coming up. She had not seen it approaching from the downriver direction, in the way she saw the approach of the Halden or the Green Bay boats. She had just, at 3:13, stood up from her chair, walked to the control panel, and raised the bridge for no reason, except that a wooden lake tug had at 3:14 passed underneath. She sat at the chair with the book in her lap and thought about that for a while. She thought about it in the quiet of the tender's booth, with the hum of the fan and the hum of the city dispatch radio in the background, and the dark of the east bank of the river outside the east window. She thought that she must have, at some point in the last 34 years, received a radio call from the skipper of the tug that had established the pattern of the 3:14 passes. She thought that she must have, on the first occasion of the first pass, been told by the skipper of the tug that his boat came through every night at 3:14 and would like the bridge raised for it every night. She thought that she must have, on the first occasion, made the arrangement. She could not remember the first occasion. She could not remember, on the reckoning, ever having a radio call about the tug. She could not remember, on the reckoning, ever having entered the pass in her logbook. She could not remember, on the reckoning, ever having thought about the tug at all. But she had, on the evidence of that night, been raising the bridge for the tug every night at 3:14, for however long she had been on the shift. She looked at her logbook. She flipped back through the pages. She looked at the log entries for the last few weeks. She saw entries for the passes of the Halden and the Green Bay boats, and the D. Henry boats, and the occasional pleasure boats. She saw the bridge lift entries at the times of the passes she had made entries for. She did not see any entry for a tug at 3:14. But the bridge had, on the evidence of every night for however many nights she had been on the shift, gone up at 3:14 and come down at 3:15. She flipped back further. She looked at the log entries from a year ago, from 5 years ago, from 10, from 20, from 30. There were no entries for a 3:14 pass in any of them, but there had, on the reckoning of a woman who had raised the bridge for the tug that night, without thinking about it, been a 3:14 pass every night for 34 years. Riola sat at the chair with a logbook in her lap. She thought. She was, on the reckoning of a woman of 61, who had done the same job on the same bridge, on the same overnight shift for 34 years, aware that something had just happened to her. She was aware that the pattern of the 3:14 passes had been in her overnight routine for the whole 34 years, and that she had, at 3:13, every overnight shift, stood up and walked to the control panel and raised the bridge without thinking about it, and that she had, at 3:15 and 22 seconds, lowered the bridge, and that she had never made a log entry for the pass, and that she had never, on the reckoning of a woman thinking about her work, thought about the tug at all. She was aware that this was not, on the reckoning of an ordinary bridge tender doing an ordinary job, an ordinary thing. She was aware that she had, at 3:13 that night, become aware of it. She did not know why. She thought about it for a while. Then she did what she did. She got up. She made herself a fresh cup of coffee. She sat back down. She picked up her book. She read for the rest of the shift. At the end of the shift, at 8 in the morning, she handed off to Halcyon room. She did not tell Halcyon about the tug. She drove home. She went back to the tender's booth at midnight that night. She was, at 3:13, aware of the pattern she had become aware of the night before. She stood up at 3:13. She walked to the control panel. She raised the bridge. At 3:14, the tug passed underneath. She watched it pass. It was the same tug, the same wooden lake tug of the same 1940s style. The same man in the same dark cap with the same pipe in his mouth and the same hands on the same wheel. The tug went under the bridge. Riola lowered the bridge. She sat down at her chair. This time she did not read. She thought. She thought about the tug. She thought about who the man in the pilot house might be. She thought about where the tug might be going. She thought about how she had, on the reckoning of 34 years, been raising the bridge for the tug, without knowing she was doing it. About how the pattern had been in her body and in her overnight rhythm, without ever coming up into her awareness. About how, on the reckoning, the tug had been going up the river every night at 3:14 for 34 years, and she had been the tender who had raised the bridge for it. And she had not, in the whole 34 years, wondered about it once. She thought about that. She thought about how many things in a person's life were like that, about how many patterns a person carried in the body without ever coming up into the awareness. She thought about the tug. She thought that maybe the tug was not, on the reckoning, a real tug. She thought that maybe the tug was a ghost tug that had been going up the river every night at 3:14, since the era in which the style of the tug had been common on the river, which would have been the late 1940s or the early 1950s. She thought that maybe the man in the pilot house was a ghost skipper of a ghost tug that had been running up the river at 3:14 every night for 70 or 80 years. She thought that maybe the tender before her had raised the bridge for the tug every night without knowing. And the tender before that, and the tender before that, all the way back to whichever tender had been the first to raise the bridge for the tug on the first night after whatever had happened that had made the tug into a ghost. She thought that maybe the tug had always been on the river. That maybe the tug had been on the river before the bridge had been built. That maybe the bridge had been built in 1908 for the reason that the tug had been coming up the river at 3:14 every night since before 1908 and had needed a bridge that could open for it. She thought about that. She did not know. She sat at the chair with the coffee going cold in the mug in her hand. She was, on the reckoning of a bridge tender of 34 years who had just come to understand what she had been doing for 34 years, in a quiet. She did not, on the reckoning of the quiet, do anything. She did not report the tug to the supervisor of the Public Works Department. She did not, on the evidence of the logbook, have anything to report. The tug had never been in the log, and to add it now would be to have to explain why she was adding a new traffic pattern to her overnight shift after 34 years, which she could not do. She did not tell Halcyon Vroon. She did not tell Werner Karsten of the Halden. She did not tell her husband Boyd, who was a retired millwright at the paper mill, and who was, when she got home at 8:30 in the morning, in the kitchen making her breakfast, in the way he had made her breakfast every morning for the 31 years of their marriage. She carried it alone. On a Saturday in late June, on her day off, Riola drove up to Green Bay to the Neville Public Museum on the west side of the Fox River. She had been to the Neville several times over the years. She had gone on her 50th birthday in 2015. She had gone once with Boyd. She had gone once with her sister from Manitowoc. The Neville had a permanent exhibit on the maritime history of the Lower Fox and of Green Bay, and it was that exhibit Riola wanted to see again. She spent 2 hours in the exhibit that Saturday afternoon. She looked at the photographs of the working boats of the Lower Fox from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century. She looked at the photographs of the tugs and the freighters and the passenger boats and the fishing boats. She looked at the descriptions of the various shipbuilders who had operated on the bay, the Burger Boat Company in Manitowoc, the Peterson Builders in Sturgeon Bay, the smaller shops in Green Bay and Marinette and Menominee that had built the working craft of the region in the specific decades before wooden hull construction had died out. She found what she was looking for on the fourth wall of the exhibit. It was a photograph taken in 1947 of a 60-foot wooden lake tug named the Halden Meridian. The tug had been built in 1942 at a small yard in Marinette. It had been operated by the Meridian Towing Company of Green Bay from 1942 through 1959, when the Meridian Towing Company had gone out of business and the tug had been sold to a buyer in Sault Ste. Marie for use on the upper lakes. The Halden Meridian had, on the plaque under the photograph, been lost in a storm on Lake Superior in the fall of 1963, with the loss of all 3 crew members. The bodies had not been recovered. The photograph showed the Halden Meridian on the Fox River, tied up at the wharf of the Meridian Towing Company on the east side of De Pere, about half a mile downriver from the Rothley Street Bridge, in the summer of 1947. The tug was painted a dark green with a white pilot house and a single stack rising from the center of the pilot house. On the deck, in the specific casual pose of a working man who had been asked to stand for a photograph, was a man in a dark cap with a pipe in his mouth. The caption identified the man as Merlin Halden, master of the tug, aged 42 at the time of the photograph. Riola stood in front of the photograph for a long time. Merlin Halden had been lost on Lake Superior in November of 1963, at the age of 58, in the sinking of his tug, in a storm that had, on the reckoning of the newspaper accounts that were framed beside the photograph, come up suddenly out of the northwest and had put the Halden Meridian on the rocks off Whitefish Point. He was, on the reckoning of a bridge tender, who had been raising the bridge for him at 3:14 every night for 34 years, still coming up the Fox River in his tug. Riola drove back to De Pere. She did not tell Boyd about the photograph. She did not tell the day tender. She went to her shift that Sunday night at 11:40. At 3:13, she stood up from the chair. She walked to the control panel. She raised the bridge. At 3:14, the Halden Meridian passed underneath. She watched Merlin Halden in the pilot house. She said, quietly, in the tender's booth, Merlin, he did not look up. He did not. On the reckoning of the 79 years he had been coming up the Fox River at 3:14 every night, look up at anyone. Riola lowered the bridge. She sat back down. She thought. She thought about where Merlin Halden was going. She thought about whether he was going to the wharf of the Meridian Towing Company on the east side of De Pere, which had been the wharf he had come home to every night in his working life from 1942 through 1959, and which had been torn down in 1961 and paved over as a small city park. She thought about whether he was going, on some reckoning of the ghost tug, to the place the wharf had been. She thought that he was. She thought that at 3:14 every night, Merlin Halden brought his tug up the Fox River past the Rothley Street Bridge and continued about half a mile upriver to the place where the wharf had been, and tied up at the wharf that was not there anymore, and secured the tug, and went home to whatever specific ghost home the specific man had in whatever specific ghost city he lived in when he was not on the tug, and slept until the specific next night, at 3:14, when he did it again. She thought that he had been doing this since November of 1963. She thought that the bridge tenders of the Rothley Street Bridge had been raising the bridge for him every night without knowing they were doing it for 63 years. She thought that she was, on the reckoning, the specific first bridge tender who had come to understand. She thought about that. She sat at her chair. She was, on the reckoning of a woman of 61, in the quiet. She wondered. She did not know. In August, on a Thursday morning at the shift handoff, Halcyon Vroon came into the tender's booth at 8, and Riola was standing at the east window, looking down at the river. Halcyon said, Riola said, Halcyon said, you have been quiet lately. Riola said, have I? Halcyon said, for the last month or so. You do not tell me the shift stories the way you used to. Riola said, I have not had shift stories, Halcyon. It has been a quiet summer. Halcyon said, Riola, you are thinking about retiring, aren't you? Riola looked at Halcyon. Halcyon was 44. She had been on the day shift for 11 years. She was, on the reckoning of Riola, after 11 years of Thursday morning handoffs, a good tender. She was quiet, on her own account. She was competent. She was, on the reckoning of a woman who had spent a career on the same bridge and had come to know the various people who tended it. Someone Riola trusted. Riola said, Halcyon, I am thinking about it. Boyd has been retired for 4 years. I told him I would go another 5. That leaves 1 more. Halcyon said, Riola, I will miss you. Riola said, you will get a new overnight tender. You will train them the way I trained you. Halcyon said, I know, but I will still miss you. Riola said, Halcyon. Halcyon said, yes. Riola said, when the time comes, there is one thing about the overnight shift I will need to tell you. It is not in the manual, and it is not in the logbook. It is a thing you will need to know. Halcyon looked at Riola. Halcyon said, Riola, what thing? Riola said, I will tell you when the time comes. Not now. When I turn in my papers, I will tell you, and whoever is going to take my shift. Halcyon said, all right, Riola. Halcyon did not press. Riola put on her jacket. She picked up her book and her thermos. She walked out of the booth into the summer morning. The sun was already up over the east side. The Fox River was moving in the light. The bridge was down at rest across the channel. She drove home. Boyd made her breakfast. She ate. She slept. For the rest of the summer, she continued to raise the bridge for the Halden Meridian at 3:14 every night. She continued to not make a log entry. She continued, on the reckoning of the outside look of her overnight shift. To be a bridge tender, doing an overnight shift on a small drawbridge in a small city in eastern Wisconsin, doing the same job she had been doing for 34 years. She was, on the inside reckoning, doing something different. She was, on the inside reckoning, keeping the bridge open for a ghost tug that had been going up the river for 70 or 80 years, and that had been coming through at 3:14 every night for as long as anyone could remember, and that had needed a succession of tenders to raise the bridge for it, and that had, on the reckoning of the evidence, been able to arrange for the succession of tenders to raise the bridge for it, without any of the tenders knowing they were doing it. Riola was the first tender to know. She did not know why she was the first. She wondered, on the quiet nights of the summer, sitting at the chair with the paperback in her lap and the fan in the window, whether the tug had decided, on the occasion of Riola's approaching retirement, to let her know. Whether the tug had, on the reckoning of the tug or the man in the pilot house, wanted Riola to know before she stopped. Whether the tug had wanted her to have the knowledge of the work she had done for 34 years. She thought that, maybe. She thought that on the afternoon of the summer, when she would, in a few years, turn in her retirement papers to the supervisor of the Public Works Department, she would need to tell the tender who came after her about the tug. She thought about that. She thought about how she would tell them. She thought that she would say, there's a tug that comes through at 3:14 every night. It does not radio ahead. You will not, on the reckoning of your first weeks, notice that you are raising the bridge for it. Your body will just do it. Do not, on the reckoning of your second weeks, question this. Do the pass. Do not log it. Do not tell anyone. Do the pass every night. The tug will go on up the river. It has been going on up the river for a long time. It needs the bridge open. That is the work. She thought that maybe she would say it that way, and that maybe the tender who came after her would understand and would take up the work. She thought that maybe the tender who came after her would not understand, that maybe the tender who came after her would want to make a log entry, or would want to notify the supervisor, or would want to have the Coast Guard identify the vessel and the skipper and the commercial license. She thought that if that happened, the tug might stop coming through at 3:14, that the pattern might break, that the arrangement that had been in place for however many years might come apart. She thought about that. She thought that maybe she would not tell the tender who came after her. She thought that maybe she would just retire, and would leave the tender who came after her to raise the bridge for the tug at 3:14 every night, the way she had, for the whole 34 years. Raised it without knowing. To do the work in the way the work had always been done. She thought about that too. She did not decide. She thought that when the time came, she would know. She went to work every night. She raised the bridge for the Halden and for the Green Bay boats and for the DNR boats. She logged the passes. She raised the bridge for the tug at 3:14. She did not log the pass. She lowered the bridge. She read her book. She waited for the dawn. At the end of the shift, she handed off to Halcyon. She drove home to Boyd. He made her breakfast. She ate. She slept. She got up at 4 in the afternoon. She had coffee with Boyd. They did their various small tasks. They had supper at 6. They watched an hour of television. She left for the shift at 11:40. She was Riola Kestrel. She was 61. She was the overnight tender of the Rothley Street drawbridge over the Fox River in De Pere, Wisconsin. She was the tender who knew about the tug. And tonight at 3:13, she would stand up from her chair, and she would walk to the panel, and she would raise the bridge. And at 3:14, the Halden Meridian would come up the dark channel from the south, with her wooden hull and her white pilot house and her single stack, and Merlin Halden at the wheel with his cap and his pipe, headed to the wharf that had been paved over 65 years before. And he would pass under the raised bridge without looking up. And Riola would watch him from the booth, and she would say his name, quietly, and he would not hear her, and it would not matter. Because she had learned, on a Tuesday in June of her 34th year on the bridge, that being known was not what he had come for. Being met was. She would meet him. She would lower the bridge at 3:15 and 22 seconds. She would sit back down. She would open her book. She would wait for the dawn. And upriver in the dark, Merlin Halden would tie up at the wharf that was not there anymore, in the way he had tied it up for 84 years, and would go home. Kel Halden was 39 years old and had been an overnight interstate snowplow driver for the North Dakota Department of Transportation for 12 years, running the stretch of Interstate 94 between Jamestown and Bismarck. And on the first Wednesday of December, 2026, at 4:12 in the morning, on the 20-mile stretch between exits east of Bismarck, he saw the first of the things on the road. He had come to the Department of Transportation in 2014. He had come to it from a job at the Bismarck Municipal Airport, where he had for 3 years, after his discharge from the Army National Guard, driven the airport's runway plows and de-icers on the overnight shift. Before that, he had done 3 tours in the Guard, 2 to Kuwait and 1 to Iraq, from 2005 through 2011. He had grown up on a farm outside Steele, North Dakota, about 40 miles east of Bismarck, and had gone into the Guard out of Steele Waldo High School in 2003 at 18. He was on the outside look of a man of 39 who had done the work he had done. Quiet. He was on the outside look of a man of 39, married. His wife's name was Merida. She was 37. She taught 5th grade at the Solheim Elementary School in Bismarck. They had 2 children, a daughter named Aline, 9, and a son named Torvald, 6. They lived in a small ranch house on the north side of Bismarck, on a quiet street called Perkerson Avenue, 3 blocks from the elementary school. He and Merida had met in 2014, in his first year with the Department of Transportation. She had been a student teacher at Solheim. In her last year at the University of Mary, Kel had been at a fundraiser for the Solheim Playground Fund at the Elks Lodge on 3rd Street on a Saturday night in October. Merida had been at a table with 3 other teachers. Kel had asked her to dance. They had been married the following summer. Aline had come in 2017. Torvald had come in 2020. They were, on the reckoning of a young family in a small city in North Dakota, doing well. Kel worked the overnight winter shift for the Department of Transportation from November through April. In the summer months, he worked the days doing highway maintenance, pothole patching, guardrail repair, mowing the medians. He preferred the winter shift. He preferred the plow. He preferred the quiet of the cab of the plow truck at 3 in the morning on a stretch of Interstate 94 in North Dakota, with the snow coming down in the headlights, and no one on the road for 40 miles in either direction. He had, in the 12 years, come to know the stretch between Jamestown and Bismarck better than he knew any road he had ever driven. He knew the places where the wind cut across the highway from the northwest and drifted the snow up into knee-high berms across the passing lane in the matter of an hour. He knew the overpasses where the ice sheeted up on the road below on cold, clear nights, when the moisture came down out of the concrete beams. He knew the place at mile marker 213, where the highway crested a low ridge, and the eastbound lane fell away toward Jamestown in a gentle grade that always carried more traffic than the westbound at the same hour, for reasons Kel had never quite understood, but had come to accept. He knew where the exit ramps iced first. He knew which overpasses collected snow. He knew every mile marker between Jamestown and Bismarck by heart. The plow truck was an International Harvester 22-yard tandem axle diesel with an 11-foot front plow blade and a side wing on the passenger side. It had been in service with the North Dakota Department of Transportation since 2017. Kel had been assigned to it since it had come out of the Bismarck yard in the summer of that year. He had, on the reckoning of the mechanics at the yard, taken care of it well. He had, on the reckoning of the supervisor of the winter operations, driven it well. The cab of the truck was, over the 12 years, the place Kel had spent more waking hours than any other place, including his own house on Perkerson Avenue. He had, over the 12 years, come to know the small sounds of the cab, the tick of the wiper motor when the wipers were on their intermittent setting, the low hum of the heater fan when it was on medium, the rattle of the CB radio in its dashboard mount when the truck went over a rough patch of pavement, the dip in the diesel's idle when the alternator switched over between charge phases. He had come to know, on the reckoning of a man who had spent about 18,000 hours in that cab, the feel of the driver's seat under his own weight and the shape his own coveralls made in the position of driving. He liked being in the cab. His assigned route was the 78 miles of Interstate 94 between Jamestown, North Dakota, and Bismarck. He ran the route eastbound from midnight to about 3:30, doing the plowing on the eastbound lanes, and then westbound from about 3:30 to 7, doing the plowing on the westbound lanes. On the westbound leg, he passed through the 20-mile stretch between exit 176 at Steele and exit 156 at Minokan at roughly 4 in the morning, give or take 15 minutes depending on the snow conditions and the speed he had been running. The stretch between exit 176 and exit 156 was, on the reckoning of a plow driver who had run it about 1,000 times over 12 years, the loneliest stretch of the route. There were no towns on it. There were no gas stations. There were no lights except the small clusters of the individual farmsteads set back a quarter or half mile from the highway on the gravel roads that ran north and south from the overpasses. On a clear December night, at 4 in the morning, the stretch had, on the reckoning of a man in the cab of a plow truck, with the plow down and the headlights on and the beacons flashing, exactly no other light in it. The horizon on either side of the road was dark to about 40 miles. The sky above was, in clear weather, thick with stars. In snowy weather, the sky was gray in the glow of the snow, reflecting the beacon lights of the plow truck back up into the cloud. Kel liked the stretch. He had driven it on the westbound leg about 1,000 times in 12 years, without incident. On the first Wednesday of December, 2026, at 4:12 in the morning, on the westbound leg through the stretch, at approximately mile marker 168, he saw a figure standing on the eastbound shoulder. The figure was wearing a long, dark coat. It was standing about 80 feet ahead of him on the far shoulder, on the opposite side of the median. Kel saw it in the yellow of his headlights. He passed it in about 3 seconds. He did not stop. He did not. On the reckoning of a plow driver on the westbound leg with the plow down and the wing extended, and a truck full of salt and sand mix behind him, have a reason to stop for a pedestrian on the eastbound shoulder 80 feet away across a median. He drove on. He watched the figure in his rear view for a moment. The figure was still on the shoulder. It did not move. It did not turn. He drove on. He did the rest of the westbound leg. He got into the Bismarck yard at 7:10. He checked in with the dispatcher on duty, a woman named Halcyon Groening, who had been on the overnight desk for 6 years. He wrote up his run sheet. He did not mention the figure on the shoulder. He drove home. Merida was in the kitchen, making the pancakes she made for the kids on the school mornings when Kel was home from his run. Aline and Torvald were at the kitchen table in their pajamas. Kel sat at the table with them. He ate pancakes. He drank coffee. He listened to Aline tell him about the book report she was working on. He did not tell Merida about the figure on the shoulder. He went to bed at 9. He slept until 4 in the afternoon. He got up. He had supper with Merida and the kids at 6. He left for the shift at 11:40. On the second Wednesday of December, 2026, at 4:12 in the morning, on the westbound leg through the stretch, at approximately mile marker 168, he saw a car on the median. The car was a dark sedan of a make Kel could not identify. It was parked on the grass of the median, headed east, with its headlights off. The driver's window was down. There was no driver visible in the driver's seat. Kel saw the car in the yellow of his headlights. He passed it in about 3 seconds. He did not stop. He had, on the reckoning of a plow driver, a reason to stop for a parked car on the interstate median. The reason being to check for a stranded driver who might need help. But he did not stop. He did not, on the reckoning of a man who had, on the previous westbound leg, seen a figure on the shoulder that had, in some way he could not exactly explain to himself. Then the kind of thing that a plow driver did not stop for, want to stop for the car either. He drove on. He watched the car in his rear view for a moment. The car did not move. Its headlights did not come on. It sat on the median in the dark. He drove on. He did the rest of the westbound leg. He got into the yard at 7:10. He wrote up the run sheet. He did not mention the car on the median. He drove home. On the third Wednesday of December, at 4:12 in the morning, on the westbound leg through the stretch, at approximately mile marker 168, he saw a dog on the road. The dog was on the westbound center line about 100 feet ahead of him. It was a large dog. It looked like a German Shepherd or a Belgian Malinois. It was standing with its head down, facing east, in the center of the eastbound side lane of the westbound side of the highway. Its eyes caught the light of Kel's headlights and shone the yellow-green of a dog's eye, reflecting a headlight. Kel saw the dog. He touched the brake, then took his foot off. The dog did not move. Kel passed the dog in about 2 seconds. The plow blade passed through the position the dog had been standing in. There was no impact. Kel felt no thump. The plow blade cut through the position without slowing. The truck did not lurch. Kel looked in his rear view. The dog was standing on the center line about 100 feet behind him. Its head was still down. It was facing east. It had not moved. Kel drove on. He did not stop. He did the rest of the westbound leg. He got into the yard at 7:10. He wrote up the run sheet. He did not mention the dog on the road. He drove home. He had, by the third Wednesday, understood some things. He had understood that on the stretch between exit 176 and exit 156, at approximately mile marker 168, at approximately 4:12 in the morning, on the westbound leg, there was going to be something on or beside the road. He had understood that the something was going to be different every time. That the figure on the shoulder had been the first instance, and that the car on the median had been the second, and that the dog on the road had been the third, and that there would be more. He had understood that the something was not actually there in the way a real thing was there. He had understood that the plow blade had passed through the position of the dog without contact. He had understood that he should not stop. He had understood that in the way A man of 39 who had done tours in places came to understand things. From an instinct that had nothing to do with analysis and everything to do with the body knowing, on the reckoning of the body, what was and what was not the right thing to do. He kept driving. On the fourth Wednesday of December, at 4:12 in the morning, at mile marker 168, he saw an old woman standing in the westbound lane. The woman was directly in his path. She was wearing a long, dark coat and a long, dark scarf tied over her hair. She was standing with her hands at her sides. She was facing east, toward Kell. She was looking at him. Kell was doing 42 miles an hour with the plow down and the wing extended. He did not touch the brake. He passed through her at 42 miles an hour. He felt nothing. The plow blade cut through the position the woman had been standing in without any contact. The truck did not lurch. The salt and sand mix in the back did not shift. Kell drove on. He did not look in his rear view. He did not want to know if she was standing behind him, watching him drive west. He drove the rest of the westbound leg. He got into the yard at 7:10. He wrote up the run sheet. He did not mention the woman on the road. He drove home. He did not eat pancakes with Merida and the kids that morning. He said he was not hungry. He went straight to bed at 8:30. He slept badly. He got up at 3. He drank coffee at the kitchen table with Merida while she graded a set of 5th grade book reports. He did not tell her. He left for the shift at 11:40. On the 5th Wednesday of December, which was the last Wednesday of the year, on December 30th, at 4:12 in the morning, at mile marker 168, he saw a man standing in the median with his hand raised. The man was Kell's own uncle, Torvald Halden, who had been the man Kell's son was named for, and who had died in a single vehicle accident on Interstate 94 at approximately mile marker 168 on an icy night in February of 1997 at the age of 41. Torvald had raised Kell after Kell's father had left when Kell had been 7. Torvald had been the closest thing to a father Kell had had from age 7 to age 12 when Torvald had died. Torvald had taught Kell to hunt. Torvald had taught Kell to drive. Torvald had taken Kell to hockey games in Fargo on weekends and had let Kell stay up late watching old Western movies on the television at his small house outside Steele. Torvald had been a wheat farmer on the quarter section outside Steele that his own father had homesteaded in 1912. He had never married. He had lived alone in the small clapboard farmhouse his father had built in 1918. He had, when Kell's father had left Kell's mother, driven the 22 miles from Steele to Bismarck every Friday afternoon to pick Kell up, and had brought Kell out to the farm for the weekend, and had taken Kell back to his mother's house in Bismarck on Sunday nights. Torvald had done this every weekend for 5 years. Kell had learned, over those weekends, everything he had come to know about the things men in his part of North Dakota knew. How to shoot, how to gut a deer, how to run a tractor, how to keep a small engine tuned, how to sit in a truck cab in a blizzard with the engine off to save gas and still stay warm enough to survive. Torvald had died on a Wednesday night in February of 1997, driving home to Steele from Bismarck after picking up feed at the co-op on the west side. He had left Bismarck at about 8:30 in the evening. His truck had left the road at mile marker 168 at approximately 10:15. The wreck had been discovered by a westbound trucker at about 11:45, who had radioed it in from a call box at exit 156. The highway patrol had gotten there at 12:20. Torvald had been dead in the driver's seat. Kell had been 12. His mother had woken him up at about 7 in the morning of Thursday to tell him. Kell had gone into his room and had shut the door and had not come out for the rest of the day. His mother had let him. She had brought him meals on a tray. She had knocked on the door in the evening and had asked if he wanted her to come in and sit with him. He had said no. He had stayed in the room all night. He had come out the next morning and had gone to school. He had not spoken about Torvald to anyone. He had never, in the 29 years since, spoken about Torvald to more than about 4 people. His mother had been one. Merida had been another. The other 2 had been men in his unit in Iraq on a night when they had all been talking about the men who had raised them. Torvald was standing in the median. His right hand was raised in a slow wave. Kell was doing 40 miles an hour. He touched the brake. He touched the brake harder. He brought the plow truck down through the gears. 40, 30, 20, 10, 5. He stopped the truck on the shoulder about 200 feet past the median where Torvald was standing. He put the truck in park. He engaged the parking brake. He turned off the plow. He sat in the cab for a moment. Then he opened the door and climbed down onto the packed snow of the shoulder. He walked back east along the shoulder to a point directly across the highway from the median where Torvald was standing. Torvald was still there. Torvald was looking at Kell. Torvald's hand was still raised. Torvald's face was the face Torvald had had at 41, on the icy February night in 1997, when he had died. Kell recognized it. Kell had, in the 29 years since Torvald had died, seen the face in photographs and in his own dreams, and in the occasional glimpses of himself in mirrors that Torvald and Kell shared the bone structure of. The face was the quiet face of a man of 41 on a February night. Kell stood on the shoulder. The wind was moving across the highway from the west at about 15 miles an hour. The temperature was about 10 below 0 Fahrenheit. There was no traffic on the interstate in either direction. There was no sound except the wind and the idling diesel of the plow truck behind Kell. Kell said into the wind, across the highway, Uncle Torvald. Torvald did not speak. Torvald continued to hold his hand up. Kell said, I have been seeing things on this stretch for the last 5 weeks. Are you what I have been seeing? Torvald did not answer. Kell said, are you the reason I have been seeing them? Torvald did not answer. Kell said, Uncle Torvald, what do you want? Torvald did not answer at first. Kell stood on the shoulder in the cold, with the wind on his face and his hands going numb in his gloves. He looked at his uncle across the highway. He looked at the quiet 41-year-old face. He looked at the raised hand. He thought about all the things he could ask. He thought about asking about the night of the accident, about what had happened, about what Torvald had seen on the road, about whether there had been a deer, or a person, or a piece of debris, or nothing at all. Torvald's truck had left the road at mile marker 168 at 8 miles an hour on an icy night in February of 1997 and had rolled into the median and had come to rest with Torvald pinned in the driver's seat. He had died before the first highway patrol trooper had arrived on scene. The accident had been ruled a single-vehicle rollover due to icy conditions and excessive speed. Nobody had ever known why he had been going 48 in that weather. Kell had wondered his whole life. He thought about asking about the things he had been seeing on the stretch, about the figure on the shoulder, about the car on the median, about the dog on the road, about the old woman standing in the westbound lane at 42 miles an hour. He thought about asking whether Torvald had been placing them there, whether Torvald had been showing them to Kell one at a time in a sequence to prepare him for something. He thought about asking what the something was. He thought about asking whether Torvald was all right, whether Torvald was in any pain, whether Torvald was. In whatever place Torvald was in when he was not standing on the median at mile marker 168 in the small hours of a December morning, at rest. He thought about all of it in the cold on the shoulder. Then he said, "Uncle Torvald, I do not know what to ask you." Torvald lowered his hand. Torvald turned and began to walk east along the median, away from Kell, in the direction of the mile marker where his accident had happened. Kell watched him walk. Torvald walked for about 100 yards. Then, Torvald was gone. Kell stood on the shoulder for a while. He was on the reckoning of a man of 39 who had just spoken to his dead uncle on the median of Interstate 94 in North Dakota at 4:15 in the morning of the last Wednesday of December, in the cold. The cold went through his coveralls and into his skin, and through his skin into his bones. The wind was moving in his ears. He was aware that Torvald had not answered his questions. He was aware also that Torvald had not needed to. The answers were, on the reckoning of a man of 39 who had done what he had done and had come to understand the things he had come to understand in the walking. Torvald had walked east along the median, in the direction of the mile marker where he had died and had disappeared. That was what he had been showing Kell for 5 weeks. That there was something at mile marker 168 that had been there since February of 1997. That the plow drivers who ran the westbound leg through the stretch at 4 in the morning were, in some way, going past it every night. That the thing was going to try to make the drivers stop. That the drivers should not stop. That Torvald was there to keep them from stopping. That Torvald had, on the icy night in February of 1997, stopped. Kell walked back to the plow truck. He climbed into the cab. He put the truck in gear. He engaged the plow. He drove the rest of the westbound leg. He got into the yard at 7:40. He was 30 minutes behind schedule. Halcyon Groening was on the desk. Halcyon said, "Kell, everything all right?" Kell said, "Halcyon, I stopped for about half an hour. I thought I saw someone on the median. There was no one there. I got out and checked. It was clear." Halcyon said, "You checked." Kell said, "I did." Halcyon said, "All right." She entered the run sheet. She did not ask any more questions. Kell drove home. Merida was in the kitchen making pancakes. Ali and Torvald were at the table. Kell sat down. He ate pancakes. He did not tell Merida about Torvald on the median. He came close to telling her that Saturday. Merida had come home from the elementary school on Friday afternoon with a school-wide announcement about the winter concert the following week, and had sat at the kitchen table with Kell that Saturday morning drinking coffee while the kids were still asleep, and had said, "Kell, you have been quiet all week. Is something wrong?" Kell said, "Merida, I am all right." Merida said, "You are not eating breakfast." Kell said, "I have not been hungry." Merida said, "Kell." Kell said, "Merida." Merida said, "You would tell me if something was wrong on the road." Kell was quiet for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the small backyard where the snow from the storm on Thursday was piled up against the fence. He said, "Merida, there has been a strange thing on the westbound leg. I have been thinking about it." Merida said, "What kind of strange thing?" Kell said, "I do not want to talk about it yet. Let me think about it. I will tell you when I have thought about it." Merida said, "Kell, is it dangerous?" Kell said, "It is not. It is not dangerous. It is not going to hurt me. I have been keeping myself safe, I promise." Merida looked at him for a long moment. Then Merida said, "All right, Kell. When you are ready, you tell me." Kell said, "I will." Merida said, "I love you, Kell. Kel said, "I love you too, Merida." They sat in the kitchen with the coffee going cold in their mugs. The morning light was coming in through the kitchen window in the pale way of December morning light in North Dakota. In the small ranch house on Perkerson Avenue, there was the quiet of a Saturday morning before the children woke. Kel did not tell her. He did not, in the end, tell her for another 18 years. He worked the shift for the rest of the winter. On the following Wednesday, at 4:12 in the morning, at mile marker 168 on the westbound leg, he did not see anything. There was nothing on the road, nothing on the shoulder, nothing on the median. He drove through the position where Torvald had been standing at 42 miles an hour and did not see him. He drove on. On the following Wednesdays through January and February and March and April, he did not see anything at mile marker 168 at 4:12 in the morning. The stretch was, on the reckoning of a plow driver on the westbound leg, quiet. He kept driving. He kept the plow down through the snow that came through the winter, in the way it always came through the winter, on that stretch of interstate. He kept the salt and sand going down behind him, at the rate the supervisor of winter operations had set for the conditions. He kept the truck at the speed the route was run at. He came home in the morning to Merida and the kids. He ate pancakes. He slept. He did not tell Merida. He did not tell Halcyon. He did not tell his supervisor. He did not tell the priest at the Lutheran church on the north side of Bismarck, where he took Merida and the kids on the Sundays he was off. He carried it alone. He thought about Torvald sometimes. He thought about the slow wave. He thought about how Torvald had been on the median in the place he had died, and had waved to Kel, and had turned and had walked away east along the median. He thought about the walk east. He thought that Torvald had been trying to tell him something. He did not know what. He thought that maybe Torvald had been telling him that he was there, that he had been there since 1997, that he was still there at mile marker 168 on the icy February night on which his truck had left the road at 48 miles an hour and had rolled into the median and had come to rest with Torvald pinned in the driver's seat. He thought that Torvald had wanted Kel to know. He thought that maybe Torvald had wanted Kel to know, so that Kel would understand that Torvald was, in some way, still keeping the stretch. That the things Kel had been seeing at mile marker 168 for the 5 weeks before Torvald had shown himself had been Torvald keeping the stretch. Torvald showing Kel the various things a driver might hit on the stretch, and showing Kel that a driver did not have to stop for them. He thought that Torvald had been telling him not to stop. He thought that Torvald had been telling him to keep the plow moving. He thought that Torvald had been telling him that Torvald himself had, on the icy February night in 1997, stopped for something on the road at mile marker 168, and that the stopping had been the thing that had killed him. He thought that, maybe. He thought that he would not know for sure. He kept driving. He worked the shift for the rest of that winter, and for the winters after. He would work the winter shift for another 18 years, until his retirement in 2044 at 57. In those 18 winters he would, on the occasional westbound leg through the stretch between exit 176 and exit 156, see things on the road at mile marker 168 at 4:12 in the morning. He would see, over the years, figures on the shoulder, cars on the median, dogs on the road, old women standing in the lane. He would see children walking east along the median. He would see men in coveralls standing at the overpass at exit 168, looking down at the highway. He would see horses. He would see once a pickup truck rolling slowly across the eastbound lane on its side. He would not stop. He would keep the plow moving. He would come home to Merida and the kids in the morning. He would eat pancakes. He would sleep. He would not tell them. He would keep the stretch open through the winters. He would do the work Torvald had on the December morning in 2026 showed him how to do. A line would go to college in 2035. Torvald would go in 2038. They would grow up and would leave the small ranch house on Perkerson Avenue and would have their own lives. Merida would retire from teaching in 2039. She and Kel would have another 5 years of Kel working the winter shift before he retired. He would retire in 2044. On the last westbound leg of his last shift on the interstate, at 4:12 in the morning of April 12th, 2044, at mile marker 168, he would see Torvald standing on the median. Torvald would raise his hand. Kel would slow the truck. He would stop on the shoulder. He would climb down. He would walk back east along the shoulder to the point directly across the highway from Torvald. Torvald would be there. Torvald would look at Kel. Kel would say, "Uncle Torvald, I am retiring today. I am not going to be on this stretch anymore. I wanted you to know." Torvald would nod. Kel would say, "Thank you for what you have been doing." Torvald would nod. Kel would say, "There will be another driver. I do not know who it is going to be. You take care of them." Torvald would nod. Kel would say, "Uncle Torvald, are you going to be all right?" Torvald would lift his hand and hold it up in the slow wave. Then Torvald would turn and walk east along the median. He would walk about 100 yards. He would be gone. Kel would drive the rest of the westbound leg. He would get into the yard at 7:40. He would sign the paperwork of his retirement. He would say the goodbyes to Halcyon Groening, who would still be on the desk after 24 years, and to the mechanics at the yard, and to the various other drivers who had, over the years, become the people Kel had come to work with. He would drive home. Merida would be at the kitchen table. He would sit down. He would drink coffee with her. He would tell her then, for the first time in 18 years, about Uncle Torvald on the median at mile marker 168. Merida would listen. She would not say much. She would put her hand on his hand. She would say, "Kel, thank you for telling me." He would say, "Merida, I am sorry I did not tell you before." She would say, "You told me now." They would sit at the kitchen table in the spring morning of Kel's retirement, in the quiet of the house they had lived in for 20 years. Merida's hand would stay on his. The coffee would go cold in the mugs. The sun would come up over the small backyard where the last of the winter snow was going into the grass. And out on Interstate 94, on the stretch between exit 176 and exit 156, at mile marker 168, in the median where he had been for 47 years, Uncle Torvald would be standing in the wind with his hand raised, the way Kel had left him, waiting for the next plow, waiting for the next driver to come west out of the dark at 4:12 in the morning with the plow down and the wing extended and the beacons throwing yellow onto the snow, waiting to teach them what he had taught Kel, waiting to keep them moving. He would wait. The road would come to him. The plow would come to him. Someone would come. And Torvald Halden, 41 years old on a February night in 1997, would raise his hand again in the same slow wave he had raised for Kel, and would begin again to do the work he had been doing since the night he had stopped for something on the road and had never gotten to go home.